Whether it's an alternate reality, distinct publishing line, or relaunch, the Man of Steel continues to be reconceived from his origin to his final fate. Over this 4-part event, we will journey from the Dark Knight universe to Earth-1, from the New 52 continuity to the Elseworld of Red Sun, as we explore whether the core of the character endures. This is Superman Reimagined. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This episode is a double feature entitled Justice for the New 52 Superman. First up, joining me to discuss Justice League Origin by Geoff Johns and Jim Lee, as well as Superman Unchained by Scott Snyder and Jim Lee, is returning guest, comic book artist, one of our favorites, V Ken Marion. Welcome back, my friend.
Hey, what's up, Anthony? Thanks for having me back, and thank you to all the listeners for having me back again. I'm psyched to talk about one of my favorite eras of DC Comics. I'm so psyched.
As am I, for different reasons, I guess. Let me just say this right at the top. I don't want to bury the lead. At the time, I can say that now, I unfairly dismissed an entire era of DC and Superman and an entire iteration of my favorite character. And I have to own it, and I do own that. I was wrong to do so, because in reading these stories, and a few others, I read a little bit more than what was officially assigned, just to get more of a sense of this version of the character. And I can say I was wrong. There's a lot of value to this era and this version of the character, and I had a great time, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Dude, I am so happy to hear you say that, man, because when it came, I know it was controversial when it came out, and I think in hindsight, I'm thinking it was controversial because they were scraping away continuity, and it was officially scraping it away, even though technically every 10 years continuity gets scraped away anyway, even if they don't really say it, but because it was this hard and fast thing with the whole universe line-wide thing, I feel like people who invested years, and rightly so, were felt dismissed by it, right? Myself, I had only really been hardcore buying comics for about 5 years prior to that. So for me at the time, I was this was my peak of buying comic books, and I was so hyped for it. I loved all the new character designs. I loved making the characters dialing them back and making them have less history and just kind of starting over. And I loved the fact the first year and a half or so across the line, they were making new characters, new villains. The whole push of a lot of it was making new things. And they kind of dialed back on that, like I said, about a year and a half, 2 years into it. But that first chunk of it, I thought was so much fun. And I was just so into, I was buying at least half the line at the time, which was the most I've ever bought of a comic book line. And I loved the Superman version of this, so much so that I was actually kind of sad when Rebirth happened, when they kind of got rid of him and brought it back to the pre-continuity version of the character, which I know a lot of people like. I'm not hating on that, but I just love this version so much. So I can't wait to talk to you about it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you say all of that, because clearly, and I knew this from our prior conversations, you and I came at the New 52 from different perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure people, don't need the history lesson, but we're talking about this period of time in DC history from 2011 to 2016, where DC relaunched their entire line, 52 titles. They even relaunched Detective Comics and Action Comics. It was a historic renumbering. And along with that, like you said, was this continuity reset. Now, as we would come to find as the New 52, unfolded, there were certain creative silos that sort of, it seemed like they were allowed to proceed more or less unchanged. A lot of the Bat books and the Green Lantern books, whatever had been really successful at the time sort of continued on. But then there were characters like Superman that saw major changes. Ma and Pa were now dead, unlike they had been post-crisis, that entire post-crisis era. Lois and Clark were no longer married or in a relationship. She didn't know his secret identity. So there were a lot of changes during that time. And my feeling then was, this is not my Superman. That was, if I had to sum it up, that was what I felt at the time. And I'm sure I've told this story on one of my podcasts, though I don't know if I ever told it on this one, but I remember that summer day when Flashpoint number 5, which launched the New 52, right after Barry Allen's timeline shenanigans, although we would later find out that Dr. Manhattan had a hand to play, but we'll get to that later. But I remember when Flashpoint number 5 and Justice League number 1 came out. They came out on the same week. Mm-hmm. And this was when so 2011, I was in law school. I wasn't working at my comic shop regularly, but I would make occasional guest appearances and I still had my key. And this was the point in time where all the retailers could get their books on Tuesdays and for sale on Wednesday. And so I remember letting myself into the store on a Tuesday night, and Steve, the owner, had not yet broken down the shipment. He was leaving it for the next morning, but I let myself in. I left everything as I found it. No one needs to worry. But I dug through the boxes until I found Flashpoint and Justice League. And I opened up a folding chair and I sat down in this empty store on a Tuesday night and I read them. And I was just like, I'm done. Like, these are not, I was like, these are not my characters. I read Justice League #1 in particular. And, all of the relationships, all of the history that had been built, it was just all gone. It was out the window. And we end on this shot of, quote unquote, angry Superman with the red eyes ready to face off against Batman and Green Lantern. I'm just like, this is not my character. And so by and large, with a couple of exceptions here and there, like, I sat out that 5-year period. And now, having read what we read for this episode, I can say that like I said, I judged it unfairly. And I think I definitely had a misconception about what this version of the character was all about. So, like I said, my view of this has changed a lot, but at the time, that was it. It was just like, this is not my Superman. But what's changed since then is A, doing this podcast, right? And exploring all of these different periods. B, your enthusiasm for this, because I know you're into it. And, that's infectious, honestly. Like, stuff like that gets me excited to want to delve into it. And then I'll also say, I've seen a lot on Twitter in particular of people talking about this era fondly, talking about it, getting them into comics or getting them into Superman. And I'll tell you this, I posted on Twitter not long before this recording, like, hey, what stories do you recommend in the New 52? I said, other than Unchained and Justice League and Morrison's Action, which we're going to cover in this episode. And the Morrison part will come in the second half of our double feature. So don't worry, folks, we'll get there. And I had more engagement on that tweet than I've gotten on a lot of others. And people had all these recommendations. The Greg Pak run on Action Comics, that was a huge one. And we'll talk about that in the second half as well. People were recommending all these stories, and it's just like, regardless of what the overall industry view is of the New 52, there's love for it out there, and that made me more interested in it. And I'm glad for that. And so I appreciate everyone who has reached out, and in particular to you, Ken, for encouraging me to do this. 'Cause it was definitely not that I needed a huge push, but it's a last little push that I might've needed.
I'm glad. I think that's funny when you're talking about Justice League, because when I got to that page at end of Justice League #1, when Superman showed up and he basically knocks Green Lantern out of the wall and he shows up. He's like, "What can you do?" Like, I was like, yes, this is awesome. Like, I was psyched. And like, we'll talk about the visuals too, but like, I think rereading these stories just now, like, I really do think this is in the comic book form, I think this is my favorite visual representation of Superman. Like, I love the suit. Like, I love the high collar. I love it's like kind of shiny armor. I love the hair that's like messy and wild looking and not like that like 50s kind of like coif, like, I love that everything just like, there's so much energy in this version of the character, and I really dug it. And I do find it interesting that you were bristled up against it so hard at the time, because at the time it felt very close to Tom Welling's version of Superman. So I think that'll be interesting to talk about, because like, it almost felt to me like, because this is like a young Superman, this is like a 23-year-old Superman in the New 52. So it's like, it almost felt like a comic booky version of what we had in Smallville if he was wearing a suit. You know what I mean? Like, so that was one of the reasons it really like latched onto me so much, was that take of him being like such a young Superman who's just starting out and like learning what to do, Well, that's a fantastic point. And that actually ties in with one of our patron questions. So Josh, one of our patrons, brought this up. And just to piggyback off of what you're saying, I think had I continued reading past issue 1, I would have realized that, that maybe it did line up with the Smallville version, or that it, wasn't such a departure from the character I knew that I thought it was going to be, but I wrote it off too quickly. And what Josh was asking about in the patron question was that there was this, he was thinking back to some of the press at the time and what was being said in interviews, and he didn't remember exactly. And I tried to do a little digging and find some interviews from that time about what the creators were saying about Superman. And I didn't really come across anything that would aid this conversation. But, Josh's view at the time was that, we were getting this younger, angrier, more impulsive Superman. And that, I guess, like that last page in Justice League kind of seemed to reinforce that.
And his question is, how, that really lines up with what we actually got. And that's the thing. And there's actually another patron question of ours from Brian, who said that I feel like the focus was more on Superman and less on Clark. And I think that goes hand in hand with some of the misgivings I had about the New 52 at the time. And I do think that on the surface, maybe from that initial appearance, maybe from some of the press at the time, that maybe that supported those views, the angrier, more impulsive, less of a focus on Clark. But now reading the stories, I found that was not the case.
No, he was younger and he was more impulsive, but he was definitely not angrier. He was more stoic, I think.
Yes.
He was like a brooding stoic version of Superman, which is not like, he wasn't angry. He was just like an icier character. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he wasn't like, maybe that's the wrong word, icy, but like, he wasn't the dad of the DC universe, like lecturing people on like the right and wrongs of what to do. He was a guy trying to figure it out himself. And he was like kind of awkward and quiet, you know what I mean? And like, he was just, I found him very relatable, but that is the version of Superman, like that time period, like the younger Superman I find to be the most relatable, because to me, the most interesting version of the character is the one who struggles, right? It's like it's the version that doesn't always have the right answer. He doesn't always know the right thing to do, but he tries. He's going to try no matter what, even if he's going to fail, but he's still going to try. And I find that to be a very powerful, relatable theme in the character. When people say he's unrelatable, I think they're thinking of the dad of the DC universe version that is just like standing there with his arms crossed, who shows up and is like kind of like wags his finger at people. And like, that's just not what this character was. This is like him at the beginning of his journey.
I agree completely. And there was a lot in Superman Unchained in particular that really reinforced a lot of that for me. When all of the satellites and the space station are falling out of the sky in the beginning and, he's trying to catch them, or when he's having his big, knockdown, drag out fight with Wraith, and, Wraith shoves him into the ocean floor and he can't breathe. And it's like, it's rare in comics for me to really be like on the edge of my seat with an action scene, because I'm usually like, well, okay, it'll be fine. And ultimately, I knew Superman would be fine, but reading those pages, and of course you have the Jim Lee art to accompany it, but I was like, well, how's he going to get out of this? I really felt myself more invested. And yeah, he is a younger, more untested version of the character, but that core, that heroic core is still there. And let me say this now, because I don't want to forget, especially with Unchained. In losing Monpa, right, that they're now dead in this iteration, and also removing the marriage between Lois and Clark, not even just the marriage, but the romantic relationship totally, I felt like we were losing the humanity, that human core of the character that we love so much. And I was so pleasantly surprised reading that Scott Snyder Jim Lee series Unchained, because those elements were still there, but just in a different way. The fact that Unchained opens with Clark recalling this tradition that he and Pete and Lana used to have in Smallville, where they would jump into the grain silo or whatever of their neighbor, or the haystack. That's what it was, the haystack. And they had these memories of him and his mother when the neighbor came to confront Clark over his powers, and the fact that the story ends with him visiting Smallville and continuing on that tradition himself. And even with Lois, even though they're not romantically involved, Lois and Clark have this great dynamic, right? Where she calls him up after he posts one of the stories on his blog, and she kind of like picks it apart and, in a friendly way, kind of needles him a bit. And they have this, this friendly, back and forth. And Superman and Lois, of course, they really are partners to a large extent, especially later on in the story. And they have a number of powerful moments. And it was just one of those things where I was like, all those things that I thought were gone, they're not. They're just changed. Yeah. They're there in a different way. But tweaks. That he's still holding on to Smallville, right? That Smallville past is still a big part of him. He carries that with him. And even though he and Lois aren't married and she doesn't know who he is, there's still that meaningful relationship. That story in particular really unlocked a lot of this for me, because I realized, again, that all of those pieces were still there, just in a different form, but that's okay.
Totally. And I think, if I remember correctly, when Superman Unchained was going on, Superman and Wonder Woman were like a romantic thing that was going on in the books. And I remember a lot of people had a problem with that. Right. And again, I thought it was like, I thought it was an interesting twist, because like DC wasn't saying that Superman and Wonder Woman are going to get married. It was like, no, this is a 23, 24-year-old Superman and Wonder Woman who are at the beginning of their lives. So it's like, I felt like it was like natural that like there'd be like, he wouldn't just like meet Lois and then like at like 23 and then like fall in love and get married. Like I just felt like it was like a progression of the character that like in Unchained, like you see that they are close friends and like there is like undertones of like something more, but it's not like on the surface. And that was like, I felt like it was, they were playing the long game with it. And obviously they didn't get there because the rebirth happened, but I felt like there was such a cool status quo they had with the character that he felt like a living, breathing character, and his whole supporting cast did too. Like Jimmy felt like modern and relevant, and Perry, and like, I don't know, man, I just really liked this era. And I do think that a lot of his humanity, like you said, was there with his interactions in the supporting cast. Like if you've never read this stuff because you thought you had those misconceptions, you should definitely go back and check it out.
Yeah, 100%. And along the lines of the Superman Wonder Woman pairing, that was going into this reading project. That was still the part that I was probably the most skeptical about. And while I didn't officially assign us to read this, I did read the first 7 issues of the Charles Soule, Tony Daniel, Superman Wonder Woman series. And I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it was good. It was really good.
It was good stuff. There's one of my favorite New 52 moments ever happens in issue number 2, where Superman and Wonder Woman have this confrontation with the god Apollo. I don't know if you remember this, but Apollo is really nasty to Wonder Woman, and he's putting down the fact that she's with this thing from the stars. And he's like, I don't care who you slut around with, like real nasty. And Superman, Clark, goes to him and he's like, are you really a god? Like, you're actually a god. This is not some affectation. And he's like, yeah, why are you asking me this? And Clark goes, well, normally when I hit someone, I have to hold back. But with you, I don't. So if you talk to her like that again, I'm going to give you everything I've got. And so Apollo hits him and, knocks him out of the place. But then Superman returns and Apollo hits him. He's the god of the sun. And he hits him with like sunlight, basically. And Clark's like, oh, you really don't know anything about me, do you? And he blasts him the hell out of there. And it was great. It was such a badass moment, but it felt in keeping with the character. Oh, man, I love that. That was one of my favorite moments. It was great. It looks like we had a little bit of a freeze there, although it froze on you smiling. Okay.
Yeah, you're still frozen on my end, but I still got the audio. So, okay, there we go.
Okay. All right. We're back. Back in action.
Yeah. We didn't read, this is my internet connection doesn't stay. Okay. Well, let's keep going until if it cuts out, that's what happens.
Yes.
We didn't read I didn't read Superman and Wonder Woman just because I didn't have time for this, but that was one of the things that we were going to. So I'm glad you did, because my memories of that were very fun. Like I thought that was a good, like at the time remembering it was like a fun story that I was definitely into issue to issue, and the Tony Daniel art was kick ass. So that was like the thing. This era of Superman had just like great art, like really great art. You had Jim Lee, you had Tony Daniel, you had Aaron Kuder, you had Kenneth Rockford, you had John Romita Jr. I know I'm forgetting some. Brett Booth did an arc in there. Like you had so many great artists working on the character. George Perez, I forgot. Like he started the new Superman book. Like he had so many great artists on it. So that was another reason I really like this era, was that there's just so much dynamics visually.
I was thinking about that, especially knowing that I was going to talk to you, an artist, and because I felt, and I don't know, maybe my perspective is a little skewed, because I guess when you have Jim Lee on, Justice League and Unchained, you're really going to let the art, carry a lot of it in instances. But also with Superman, Wonder Woman, it really felt like the art was allowed to breathe and tell the story. Like these didn't feel like, and this might sound like a knock, and I don't mean it that way. They didn't feel like very, dense, overwritten stories. It really felt like they had more of that feel of a, widescreen blockbuster action, the big splash pages, the double page spreads. And it just felt like the art was allowed to carry a lot more of it. Is that your sense too? And do you think that's part of the reason why you liked it so much?
Definitely, for sure. Definitely. Like, because art, I always favor art, like pretty much over everything with these characters. Cause that's what kind of like stokes my imagination for just the characters in general. So like, yeah, that was a huge part of it for me. It was like just the visuals of like the whole universe. Like I said, like the design of him, I loved the black S on the back of his cape. I loved like the collar, and like I loved that suit, and I just think it looked so good. Like, I don't know. I know some people really like the classic suit, but I just really dug this one. And I said, as someone who likes all versions of Superman, it's not like I'm crapping on one. I'm just saying I really like this one.
No, I hear you. We've talked about this before. I'll say it again. When it comes to the red trunks, I really don't feel that strongly. I know people, they'll die on that hill, and I'm not one of those people. I don't object to them being there, but I definitely don't miss them when they're gone. And like I've always said, and I say this as a lay person when it comes to the art side of it, I think as long as you have either the red or yellow belt, something to break it up, to break up all the blue, I think that's really all you need. And I think the red belt more than does the trick. And it's funny because, you and I have talked a lot on this podcast about Tyler Hoechlin in Superman and Lois and Henry Cavill in Man of Steel. And, both of those costumes, the modern, on-screen depictions that we've got, no red trunks.
Yeah, it's fine. It works fine. No one sees them and is like, I don't know who this character is.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
the collars, the Jim Lee collars for the New 52, I could take or leave those. I don't feel that strongly about those either. I like the look of this costume. I wouldn't go as far as you. I wouldn't say like this is my preferred look, but I definitely liked. I mean, to be clear, I really did like it. I don't. If it had stuck around, I wouldn't have minded. I guess the Rebirth version that came right after, which streamlined it a bit and got rid of some of the lines and the collars, but still, used the belt instead of the trunks. That's probably one of my favorites, I would say.
That's a good one. That is a good one. Yeah. Yeah. What do you want to talk more about Unchained, or do you want to go to Justice League? Like, what would you want to do?
Yeah, let's do. Well, the last thing I just want to say about Superman and Wonder Woman, and then let's go to Justice League is, like I said, I was really skeptical about putting them together. But number one, if you're going to reset continuity to any extent, such that you are undoing Lois and Clark being together, you damn well better explore something new. So I'm glad they did that, if for no other reason, like this is your chance. So I'm glad that they did it. And I really liked the dynamic between them. What was funny was that when you have Lois and Clark, even though he was raised as a human, he does have this sense of otherness to him. And Lois is that tether to the human side, right? She can kind of, bring that out of him and share her world with him. And what's really interesting is I like when you can put a different spin on something. So you pair Clark and Diana, and now he's the one who has the stronger connection to humanity. And then there's that tension of, how much of his world and the Clark Kent identity is he going to share with her? So it puts a different spin on it. And then the other thing too is that what still feels familiar is that there's still this workplace romance aspect to it. It's not Lois and Clark investigating stories at the planet together, but it's Superman and Wonder Woman in battle together. So it was this really nice blend to me of a familiar type of dynamic, but with a different spin on it. And there was a tenderness between them, despite being these fierce warriors. I don't know. I was very pleasantly surprised by how much I liked the two of them together. I got to tell you.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, man. Because I know it was controversial when it happened, but I think a lot of the controversy came mainly from reading headlines and not actually reading the stories. I mean, if you did read the stories and you hated it, more power to you. That's cool. But I really dug what they were doing with it, and I get why people like the version of Superman now that has Jonathan and is married, and I totally understand that. I totally get it. And it's a version of the character that I like as well. I love Superman and Lois, the TV show. I do like him as a dad. But I don't like when he feels like the dad to the universe, if that makes sense. I like him to still feel like relatable and vital in a way that can appeal to more than just people like us in our 30s and 40s, and that's what I thought was so good about this version of the character, was that this totally would have been something if I was 10, I would have loved, it would have been the kind of version that kind of how I've always seen him in my head, to be honest with you, because of things like Smallville and the movies. So I don't know. It just really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I know. I agree. I don't need him to be the dad of the DCU. He should, he should be able to kick everyone's ass every now and then, and sometimes actually do it like he does in Justice League.
Exactly. Oh, dude, I can't wait to talk about his role in Justice League.
One last thing, and then we'll get to Justice League, I promise. But because this is a big picture thing, and this was something that I was thinking about a lot with respect to the New 52 generally, and it's very easy to Monday morning quarterback this thing 6 years after it ended. However, two things that I feel were sort of fatal mistakes that DC made, just from my perspective. Number one is assuming that they were going to go full ahead as they did with resetting continuity. I think they shot themselves in the foot with fans like me, right? By not giving us a whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow-esque ending to the post-Crisis Superman. You know, before Crisis on Infinite Earths, if you were reading in the Gold and Silver Bronze Age, you got that 2-part Alan Moore story where you got to see payoffs to everything that you ever wondered about as a Superman fan. And I really think if they had just done that for the post-Crisis readers, it would have made the New 52 a lot more palatable. And it always drives me nuts because it's like, they from a marketing standpoint, but they could have had a field day with this. Whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, the Dark Knight, the Emerald Archer? They could have gone on and on with these little farewell stories. And it just, at least it would have put a bow on that era. Because that's the thing, looking at it. And I remember at the time you were just reading the books and they just stopped. And then we had the New 52. I think that number one, that's one of the things that I think was just fatal.
Which that's totally fair. That's totally fair. Monday morning quarterback assessment of. Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. That I'm actually shocked because that would have been something that would have sold really well, like across the whole line. So,
and then number two, and I will die on this hill. I don't understand. I mean, I understand, like, from the Dan DiDio perspective, like wanting to make as big a splash as possible. We are relaunching action. We are relaunching detective. This is our line of comics. I do get that. But I say to myself, could this not have been something a la the Ultimate Universe, where it could exist alongside the DCU and maybe still exist today? Because I look at these stories and I'm like, I love the stories of the family unit of Clark and Lois and John. But I also love Clark and Diana. And if there could be a scenario where there's an opportunity to have both, it just seems like this would have been better served as an answer to the Ultimate line. And maybe it still could have had a future, because I think that, but the way they did it, and I mean, look, this is really a whole separate conversation, but I've read a lot of recent interviews. I think Polygon, that site, they did this lengthy oral history of the New 52, and they interviewed DiDio and Scott Snyder and a bunch of people who were involved. And they all talked about how it was real exciting at the beginning. There was a lot of energy behind it, but there was not a master plan. And there was a lot of confusion internally about what continuity was still intact and what wasn't. And, they talked about it in the interview where you had these editorial silos and, books would be planning to do something with one character and then another editorial group would be like, oh, no, like that history no longer applies. And so I think it just got to this point where everyone, readers and creators and editorial, everyone was confused about what's in and what's not. And on top of that, you have the fact that certain elements that were so familiar to people were gone. And I think it just got to a point, coupled with declining sales, where they had no choice but to do something like Rebirth. And I just wonder if it had been its own continuity, if that might have served it better. I mean, we'll never know, but I can't help but think it would have been. Yeah,
there could have been. You're right. Like if they still did what they did and relaunched everything, but like say 2 years in, like reveal that it was an alternate universe or something, you know what I mean? And then like you could have picked up the old numbering from the old stuff and then concurrently kept the New 52 running. Like, because like I do think that, you know what I mean? Like I think that's what had a lot of people coming into the stores, like people like me who were just like I was like, for the first time in a long time, I didn't know what was going to happen. Right. Like it was like, what's different, what's changed, so yeah, I could agree with that assessment though. And like you're saying, like, I didn't know that about the behind the scenes stuff. Like there could have been maybe better planning maybe, but like, but who knows? Because I didn't start working at DC until Rebirth. Like they were just starting Rebirth when I was doing Bloodlines. So like my whole interaction with the DCU is post Rebirth. So I have no idea what it was like working on the books behind the scenes at that time, but yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've gleaned from the interviews, especially recent ones. And yeah, here's one example, very clear example. I could have sworn, I could be wrong, but I could have sworn that at the time in interviews that it was said the death of Superman had occurred in this new 5-year timeline.
It did. I remember that. Yeah.
Well, did it? Because when we get to the Doomed storyline, which I didn't read, but they tease Doomsday in those first few issues of Superman Wonder Woman, where they have that fight in the ocean, and we find out that Doomsday was in the Phantom Zone.
Okay.
And there's no mention, at least, of Superman having fought him to the death before. So so I guess my point is, it's like, I don't know. And it seems like something that should be clear. So in any event, that I think is a whole other piece of it. But let's start with Justice League. So especially upon reread, I mean, what stood out to you? What struck you about this?
Well, I mean, number one, right off the bat, it's very clear to me that the Snyder universe of the movies takes a lot from the New 52. And I was realizing that going back is that I was like, whoa, there's like scenes like lifted right out of this Justice League origin. Like this Justice League origin was kind of like the template for Zack Snyder's Justice League. And like, I think the comics, like mainly I did notice that Green Lantern was sorely missing in those movies because he adds so much to that arc. Like he's kind of the point of view character of the reader in that arc. And Superman, I love how he's used in Justice League because he's, like I said, he's like a stoic, brooding, like more badass version of the character that like doesn't say a lot, but when he shows up, you pump your fist and he kicks ass. And and it's known he kicks ass. Like, and it's just so cool to see Superman be like respected in that way of like, no, this guy's the powerhouse, like he is like the guy you don't want to fuck with,
you and I texted about this and you wisely, you were like, save it for the podcast. I was just too excited, but, no, that was my big takeaway from reading the origin arc of Justice League was how much the Snyder movies used it as a blueprint. And I'll be honest, because I've soured on Geoff Johns a little bit in recent years, especially given, the reports of his involvement in the Jossification of the Snyderverse. I'll leave it at that. But his role in sort of changing the course of the DC movies, I've kind of soured on him a bit. But I read Justice League Origin and it's like, and talking about specific moments, I mean, things big and small. The moment in the Wonder Woman movie where she tries ice cream for the first time and she congratulates the ice cream vendor right out of this story. And a much bigger moment when the Flash, oh man, I couldn't believe this was straight from the comic. But
the hot dog thing?
Not even the hot dog, but when Superman is able to stop him and flick him when Flash is in super speed. I didn't even notice the hot dog thing.
It's that scene. It's that scene when he flicks him and he goes flying back into a hot dog cart. And there's like and it was like, that was, when I was reading again, I was like, that must have been where they got that from for the Snyder cut, And like, yeah, but you're right. Like him fighting Superman, he's like seriously, like I've never been touched like ever. And like, he's like dodging around and then like Superman kind of fakes him out and then like just hits him like, and it just like sends him flying. Like, yeah, so good.
It's funny to me because, and I don't know if for people who've been listening to all these episodes, maybe this theme has emerged where it's not that I like Superman to be angry as a default setting, but when he does, he's not here. Yeah. I agree. And that's why I think I like this, but I do like moments where he is able to let that side of him out. And you and I did a whole lengthy episode on Zack Snyder's Justice League, but if you would have told me that one of my favorite moments from that movie and what would become one of my all-time favorite Superman moments, would be him blocking Steppenwolf's axe, freezing it with his breath, saying not impressed, and then kicking
him, yeah. Kicking him in the chest.
And then
you hear that, Doug Ellen? He kicked him.
And then pummeling him mercilessly.
Yeah.
I never would have thought, I'm expecting to see that. And it was, to me, it was so effective. And so, again, I think moments like those, when used judiciously, it just shows, the power of the character and a power that he normally does keep in check. But when he lets it out, it's so impactful.
And it's cool. It's cool. It's like, it reminds, because I feel like by neutering that aspect of him, you're forever dooming him to be less popular than Batman. Like flat out. Like Batman's popular because he kicks ass. Like you can say all you want about how he's relatable because he's a human and stuff. He's not relatable. He's like the most unrelatable character there is. He's just like, he just kicks ass and people think he looks cool and like they want to be Batman, right? And like by taking that away from Superman, you kind of are like making him less viable as a franchise. So like I love when they they mix that fun wish fulfillment, things that you liked when you were a kid, when you were like a kid reading these books, you're like, oh man, I wish I could like fly and stuff like that. Like that's the stuff that I feel like more often than not gets kind of taken down and like numbed with Superman. And like I just love how when stories like this, they really amp that up and they make him like, no, he is Action Comics. He is like the guy that, you know, can rocket around the earth at like 1,000,000 miles an hour and like beat up like crazy powered aliens and stuff, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and the other thing too with the Justice League arc, that first 6-issue arc was set 5 years in the past, right? Just as they were all coming together. So yeah, you are getting that, you know, maybe more impulsive, you know, version of the character at that point. And we do meet him at the end of that first issue with the red eyes as he's encountering Batman and Green Lantern. But you get that spread in issue 2 where Green Lantern tries to contain him and he just breaks those chains.
Breaks it apart. Yeah.
I mean, it's gorgeous.
I love Flash and Green Lantern's dynamic when Green Lantern calls Flash on the phone and he's got like a green shield around him and Batman, and Superman's basically like pummeling him through the city, and he's like, Flash, help. And Flash's like, no, I can't get involved. Like the cops are on my case. He's like, dude, this guy's gonna kill us if you don't help us, you know? Like, and it's like, and you see the shield breaking, and so it's like it's unquestionable reading that book that Superman's like the most powerful character of the Justice League, you know?
Absolutely. And then in a subsequent issue where he takes that truck and uses it like a baseball bat against the parademons.
So awesome.
And again, he's not saying anything while he's doing it. It's really, you know, there's just this raw energy, I think, to the New 52 Superman, especially what we get in Origin and what we'll talk about in the second half of our double feature in that introductory Grant Morrison arc where, you know, it really calls to mind the golden age beginnings of the character where, yeah, he is more brash and a little bit in your face, but I don't know. I find that aspect of the character refreshing.
But he's not irresponsible though. Like
right.
That's the thing is like we're saying he's brash and impulsive, but like we're saying that in comparison to like other versions of Superman, not as like a character trait compared to like normal people, if that makes sense. Like he's still a hero. He's still doing the right thing. He's still trying to do the right thing. You know, he just doesn't have all the answers.
Yes. Well, kind of, I want to jump to Unchained for a minute. And another aspect of it that made me think of the Snyder movies, you know, towards the end of Unchained, as Unchained was, you know, a 9-issue series. I think it was originally meant to be an ongoing, and Snyder and Lee were going to do the first arc and then maybe hand it off. And it ended up just being a 9-issue series in any event. Towards the end of the story, Lex Luthor gives his dissertation on Superman, essentially. And I thought of you because you and I have talked about this before in relation to Batman v Superman, right? In that movie, you have all these talking heads, the whole movie talking about like what Superman stands for, you know, what he's all about, the implications of his use of power. And then there's the one talking head that's like, you know, he might just be a guy. You know, he might just be a guy trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And Luthor gets at that idea when he gives his whole thesis because he talks about creating some device that allowed him to map, you know, solar activity. And that was his way of sort of tracking Superman over time. And he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, it was like, I thought I would see some sort of, you know, meaningful pattern here about what Superman was trying to accomplish. And instead what I saw was a lot of trial and error, right? As if he was just, you know, trying one thing and it didn't work. And then he tried something else. And it's like, yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah.
He's like just trying his best.
I loved that part. Like, I totally forgot that was in the book when I was reading it. I was like, this is awesome. And the way Lex is saying it, he's saying it in a very negative way, right? Like he's saying it in the sense that like which I love that this is in here because he's saying it in the sense that like we've all looked to Superman as if he's like shaping our destiny and he has this like noble cause and he has all the answers. But in looking at his activities and like seeing what he's done, he is just like fumbling his way through it, you know? And like, I love that because to me, that is what Superman is. He is just a guy. Like, I don't like, I get when in movies they do the Christ imagery and everything, right? But like, he's not a god. Like he's literally just a dude who has like really good talents and he's just trying to do the best of what he's got. And like, that's my version of the character. And to see, and Lex says it in a very negative way in that book, but to me, I took it in a very, to me, it was like reaffirming is like, yeah, it's more relatable. It's like, yeah, he can fly around the earth and stuff, but like, that's like an analogy for someone who can be like a really great like doctor, or like someone who, like, whatever your abilities are as a person, right? Everyone has gifts, everyone has weaknesses, right? And like Superman, like us, has both, and he's just doing the best he can with what he's got to make a positive difference, right? And that's a very powerful analogy for like regular people, like normal people like us reading the books. Like it to me, that to me is the heart of the character.
Absolutely. And but what was so fascinating, and I was especially looking at this, having just done all those Lex Luthor episodes that I did on the podcast, where I agree with you when he gives that thesis, it is in a negative light. But then on the next page or so, he's talking about the initial message that the government had sent out into the stars, back in the 30s, that resulted in this character Wraith coming to Earth, right? Who's one of our antagonists in the story. And Lex talks about how, that message, is a mathematical equation that didn't really work, right? The sum was greater than the parts, but the idea was that we're looking for someone to come and help. But even Luthor is able to recognize, he says, again, I'm paraphrasing here, but the spirit of it is he said, I used to think that Superman was trying to be the answer to that equation, and I hated him for it. And then now I realize that he wasn't. And in not trying to be the answer to that question, in just being this guy, he might actually be that answer after all. So it's like, even that's the thing. Even Luthor is able to see that. I think it says a lot about both characters, to be honest. But yeah, I love that. But again, that's the thing. Not to say that it takes away from my appreciation of the Snyder movies, but it's like reading these stories, like, it really took a lot from this era in particular.
It did, yeah. What did you think about Wraith?
Wraith was interesting. I mean, the idea that he came to Earth in 1938, of course, is a nice nod to the debut of Superman in the real world. I guess I thought there was going to be more of a twist as to Wraith's true identity or origins or motivations, and I didn't know that we really went there, but I did like this contrast, right? The idea that Wraith is this government operative, right, and does whatever he's told, and has this allegiance to our country, and is really at odds with Superman in that respect. When all of the nuclear weapons on Earth are unleashed, and Wraith is like, well, we can stop the ones that are heading towards America. And Superman's like, no, we can stop them all. Yeah. That really spoke to the difference between them. So yeah, I thought it allowed for, again, some interesting ideas about the nature of Superman. Overall, I was on board. What did you think? Yeah,
I really liked him. I liked that it was a new character, right? It was a character, he looked cool. It was a new character that easily could have been Zod or another Kryptonian. Like, easily could have been any one of like Superman's like previous antagonists. But he's not really a bad guy, though. That's the thing, is like, I guess the twist with Wraith is that, like, he's this character that lands on Earth in 1938 and becomes indoctrinated into the U.S. government's program, basically becomes the Winter Soldier in DC. Like, that's basically what he is. He's like a Superman who carries out like government, like black ops missions. And in the very beginning, they say he was the second bomb dropped on Nagasaki, I think, it wasn't a bomb, it was Wraith. Like, that's like the idea that they have in this book. And so you're waiting the whole book because he's at odds with Superman, because Superman is at odds with General Lane, who's commanding Wraith, right? And throughout the whole story, Wraith keeps saying stuff like, I'm going to have to end up killing you eventually because you're not on board with the program. And then it's revealed that Wraith was sent here by these aliens that sent him here, and that it's like an armada of these aliens. Like, basically Wraith brought all this technology to kind of jumpstart the Earth's technological advancement for then his race to then come and kind of like take it over and then kill us all and like take over, right? But like, so you're waiting for Wraith to turn on everyone, right? And the twist is that Wraith is not, like, he has no allegiance to his own people. His allegiance is straight up to the United States of America. And like, at the end, when Superman is going to die fighting this armada coming in, Wraith is the one who actually shows up and sacrifices himself to save everyone. So Wraith actually was a hero at the end, Like, I thought he was a very cool character.
Yeah, I agree. And a tragic character, right? Because so much of his story mirrors Superman's, but missing those key pieces, right? Unlike Jor-El and Lara sending Kal-El to Earth to save him, his salvation, here he is this unwitting advance agent for his people. And unlike Superman, who's found by Jonathan and Martha, who, as we've talked about over and over, and I think for any Superman fan, we recognize this is the key, that, that upbringing, that time in Smallville, that's what That's what makes a difference between Superman and any of these other characters with that level of power. And, you know, Wraith unfortunately doesn't have that. He has the tutelage of the United States government and the orders of Sam Lane, which I got to tell you, and maybe this speaks to the youthfulness of this version of Superman, but I really bought into the antagonism between Clark and the General, and I loved the little thing, but I love that Superman always only called him Lane.
Yeah.
I love that. I thought that was great. And it's funny now because I don't know how so used to it we are, because it is an outlier. But, you know, recently we've had this version of Sam Lane on Superman and Lois, who's in the inner circle, who's trusted, who's an advisor. It's a much different dynamic than we've seen with Sam Lane in the past. But, you know, reading this, you definitely buy into this conflict between them.
I do like when Superman puts on that like mech armor to fight Sam Lane basically has like a platoon of like this like high tech soldiers attack the Fortress of Solitude, and Superman comes out of the fortress to fight them, and he's got this like crazy Kryptonian mech armor, and Sam Lane is like, figures, it's like you'd pick now for like the time that I actually start to like you, and he's got this like giant hammer, and so it's really cool moment.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And you know, when Sam gives his dissertation on Superman, why he's opposed to Superman, I thought that was interesting too. I mean, he basically calls Superman a mass murderer for not taking certain actions, for not for not taking out dictators and inserting himself in world affairs on behalf of the United States government. Yeah. So, you know, again, I thought that was just an interesting insight into, you know, what's driving the tension between them in this version of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was a really good book, man. I can't remember when it was coming out if there were delays or not. I really can't remember. There were. Because I remember like toward the end, people like not being as excited about it, but like reading it all the way straight through, it's like, this is like a really good story. And like, I love the dynamic between Batman and Superman in it too, because Batman doesn't overshadow. He's like a supporting player in this story in like the best way possible, you know?
Well, when Wraith shows up at the Batcave and Bruce just launches all the Batmobiles and all the weaponry at him, he's like, oh, it's all insured. It was great. Yeah. Like, it was such a cool moment. Yeah, I really did like, and now I might be conflating some of these stories, but I might be in Superman, Wonder Woman, where I feel like Bruce gives Clark some good advice about his relationship. And one of the things that he says to Clark is about how, what you and I were just saying, that Clark ultimately sees himself as a normal person with these abilities, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas Wonder Woman doesn't. I mean, to Wonder Woman, she's part of these exceptional Amazons, and she's even exceptional among the Amazons. Like, it's they're sort of coming into the relationship with those different perspectives. I thought the insight that Bruce shared in one of those issues, I thought was pretty spot on. I like their dynamic in this New 52.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's very, very cool. And it was in Justice League too, which there's a cool dynamic with Batman in Justice League, which I thought, like, hopping to Justice League, I thought it was a very, like, it highlighted the ridiculousness of someone like Batman being part of the Justice League, but also underscored why he needs to be in the Justice League. You know, it was very, very cool way of handling that character in that scenario when he goes to save Superman, and he's like, because he's a normal guy, he's the one who can go save him, you know? It's very cool.
Yeah, that was clutch. You're right, though. I mean, Green Lantern in that Justice League origin story really does play a pivotal role. I know you do wonder what the Justice League movie, for example, would have looked like would have
been so much better,
you know, with that character in the mix, and especially Batman and Green Lantern. Oh, did you ever read the Geoff Johns final arc on Justice League, the Darkseid War?
Yes. Yeah, it was good.
So again, that was not a sign for this, but after reading Origin, right, and seeing the New 52 team's first battle with Darkseid, I was curious to read their final one in the Darkseid War. And so today I carved out some time and I read it. Dude, I was blown away. It was so good.
Yeah, it's really good. And shout out to Jason Fabok, who did all the art on that, which was like killer.
The art was really, it was really stellar. I was very impressed by that. Francis Manipul, he did a couple of issues in the middle there, but largely, it was, oh man, it was so good. I mean, we would be here forever if we broke down, you know, that entire story. But again, it brings everything full circle with Darkseid, and we have this battle between the Anti-Monitor and Darkseid, and the various Justice League members become gods. I mean, there's a ton going on, but it was It was great. And this is a story I'm sure people remember when Batman sat in the Mobius chair and he had access to all of the information in the universe. And Green Lantern is really the one he's, sort of paired with for a lot of that story, which again was a nice full circle moment since they start this Justice League series together. But oh man, Darkseid War was really good.
Yeah, I wish I had time to reread that because that was one I remember loving when it came out. And I have the trade paperback for it too. Like I don't remember the details of it off the top of my head, but like I remember it being like really kick ass.
Yeah, there's some good stuff in there on specifically with respect to Superman. Superman and Luthor end up on Apokolips together, and Superman's powers are depleting because he doesn't have the red sun. And this is the point in the story where Luthor is a good guy, right? He's helped save the world in the Forever Evil. And now he's an ally, a member of the Justice League. And Superman's powers are waning, and Luthor drops him in one of the fire pits because the solar energy will restore him. And it does, but it's a corrupted version, and Superman becomes the god of strength.
Yeah.
He's got that negative effect. But you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of Clark on Red K in Smallville a little bit.
Yes.
Where he says stuff he wouldn't normally say because he's facing off with Luthor and he's like, I can smell the fear on you, essentially. And Lex is like, well, maybe I'm just preparing for battle. And Superman goes, what battle? This has only ever gotten as far as it has because I allow it to. And again, it's just one of those moments where it's like, thank you.
Yes.
It's really, if anyone hasn't read Darkseid War, I don't know that I'll ever do a whole episode on it, but I just wanted to read, I guess one of the final moments of this New 52 era. And yeah, man, it was so good. And that art, damn.
Yeah. The whole Justice League run was really good. The whole, that Geoff Johns run, because it started with Geoff Johns and Jim Lee. And then I think Ivan Rice was in a chunk of it. Because there was an Aquaman crossover story and then I believe it went to the Francis Manapul part. There might have been someone else in there that was like a small part. I think the Forever Evil stuff was in between. I think because there was like one shots and stuff in there. But yeah, that whole run was like really good. So if anyone wants some great Justice League, check out the New 52 run from start to finish because it's really good.
Yeah, for sure. What else about the Justice League arc or anything else that you want to talk about?
Well, because I was going to say about the Justice League arc, like why I think Green Lantern was so missing in the Snyder movies was that it felt like his character was split in the movies between Flash and Aquaman. Like it was like, it's like they took like the jokes and the funny aspect of him and gave it to Flash. And they took his like dude, bro, cool aspect and gave it to Aquaman. And like, neither Flash nor Aquaman are really like those characters in this, but you know what I mean? Like both of them are like, Barry's kind of square and nerdy and Aquaman's very like stoic and regal. And like neither of but in Green Lantern's that character who like occupies that space of like the funny, cool guy, that like is relatable to audiences. And like, I missed Hal so much in the Green Lantern. Like in rereading this, I was like, man, he just adds so much to the dynamic of the team. Cause he says stuff that, like about Batman, like not having powers. He's like, we already got one guy pretending to like be somebody, and he has the green arrow pointing to him and stuff. Like it's really funny.
Yeah, no, your point is well taken. And actually, literally the one moment in the Justice League comic is when he's touching Wonder Woman's lasso, right? And he's revealing what he truly thinks. And of course, in Justice League, we got that exact moment with Aquaman.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. But this Green Lantern one was so much better though, because it spoke to his character. In the Joss version, it was like Aquaman was basically like hitting on Wonder Woman in like a very like odd way. But in this, it was Green Lantern was like he said something like, "Oh, I'm going to do this because I want to impress you. In fact, the reason I do anything is just so that I can impress people." Like like it gets to the heart of like all his like swagger is like it's really just because of like insecurities of like wanting to like be liked,
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, well, with the exception of Green Lantern, it utilizes the same lineup. A lot of Cyborg's arc plays out very similarly.
Exactly from the same.
The beginning at the football game and the father's empty seat. To the
and
accident.
Dad who works with like the mother boxes and the superhuman tech.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was very similar. Again, this, for the most part, this lineup of the team and the fact that they're facing off against, initially Parademons and then Darkseid. Yeah. I mean, It really hit a lot of those similar beats. And then that's why reading Darkseid War and going back to our other conversations, would love to see a continuation of Zack Snyder's Justice League, because if we got something even along the lines of of like that Dark Side War, it's like it would be so cool, and it would be a great payoff to everything that's been set up. But yeah, I was definitely very struck by by how much the movies took from this story, not even just this entire era, but this particular story.
Yeah, the 6 issues. Yeah. What did you think? What were your thoughts on Superman in Origins specifically, like on his role?
Well, again, it's funny because he doesn't say a lot, right? But through his actions, I mean, there's initially that throwdown, and then Batman's eventually able to get through to him. The moment with the truck as the bat against the parademons was great, and he ends up getting taken to Apocalypse, and Bruce rescues him and says, like, we need Superman, and so we have to have a bit of teamwork, and Cyborg is the one who's ultimately able to close the boom tubes and everything. But it's it's Superman standing toe to toe with Darkseid. I mean, like, that's the moment I think in that book.
Exactly. Yeah. He's the one who delivers the final blow. Yeah, it's so good, dude. And I love the moment when him and Flash are running away from the Omega beams.
Yeah,
that was a cool moment too.
I know. Well, and even when going back to the Superman Wonder Woman of it all, when Wonder Woman enters the battle, and she and Superman are side by side, and I think he might say something like, "You're strong," or something like that, and she's like, "I know," and it's. That's the thing, especially in this version of the story where he doesn't have his parents to fly home to, right? I can look at the end of the day. Is the New 52 Superman my preferred version of the character? Not necessarily, but it's definitely a valid one. And,
totally, yeah.
And the idea that he's going to find his place in a community like the Justice League because he's around other people. I guess that's the thing. Me in particular, like, I always look at the farm, right? The farm is where he goes, and that's where he's himself. And in a lot of the post-crisis stories, I think that holds true. But in something like this, where that piece of the story has ended, I think in that superhero community, that is where he's able to really be himself in a way that he isn't otherwise. And so to forge a romantic connection with Wonder Woman, again, I think that makes sense. I did also read ahead. I know you had asked if we wanted to do the villain's journey, the next arc in Justice League, and I was like, no, we don't have to. I actually did end up reading it because I was on a roll.
Yeah.
And that arc ends with the first kiss between Superman and Wonder Woman. And the lead up to that, he talks about his Clark Kent identity. And she's like, well, why do you still be Clark? And he says, well, I was raised with it, and it allows me to protect the people close to me. And he's like, but I still don't feel close to the people next to me, or, something to that effect.
Yeah.
So again, I think there is, how do I put this? I'm not saying that the New 52 Superman is, a downer or sullen or anything like that, but there is more of a sadness to the character, a loneliness.
He's brooding. Yeah, he's a brooding version of the character for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, I think that's why when you then pair him with Wonder Woman and you allow for something like that, it tracks. It makes sense.
Totally, dude. 100%. I'm so glad that you got that from it too. Like, dude, I'm just so happy that you enjoyed reading these books and that you went beyond what we were going to talk about. So that's a true sign that you were having fun with it. That
yes. And lest, because I know a lot of what I'm citing are the moments where he's a badass, lest anyone think that's all I'm looking for. One of my favorite moments in Unchained is the end when he is ready to sacrifice himself, right? When this armada is approaching and Lex gives him this, liquid solar energy, right? That will turn him into this bomb, right? Yeah. And he'll be able to annihilate the invading force, but it'll cost him his life. And he's ready to do it. That's
and the reason he doesn't do it is because Wraith knocks it out of, Wraith is the one, he's going to do it, and Wraith comes up behind him and tackles him and then grabs it from him and then is the one who takes it from him. It's like Superman's gonna do it. Yeah, for sure. It's yeah.
So that heroism is still there, and the Lois and Clark is still there, right? Because Superman says to Lois, well, you would do it, right? Because he's trying to talk him out of it. So that heroism, that self-sacrifice, it's still there. And the fact that Wraith intervenes, I mean, Wraith would not intervene had it not been for the example that Superman set. So again, I think all of the core attributes of the character are still at play. I can't believe if you had told me a few years ago I'd be doing this episode, I'd be like, nah, I don't think so. But I've really come around on it. And, I know we're talking about a few stories in particular. I know that And one of our patron Brian, one of his questions was about, how well thought out or lack thereof the New 52 was. And we spoke about that a bit. And look, I know we're talking about a few specific stories, maybe even the best of the New 52. I know that, like we talked about, there were some inconsistencies. I know at the outset between Grant Morrison's, Action Comics and the George Perez Superman, it was unclear exactly how everything lined up. I get all of that. And I'm not saying that, this entire era was a masterpiece for the character, but overall, this take on the character, I very much enjoyed it. And also, just a technical note here, for the reading that I picked for this episode, what you and I are talking about, and then what Ralph and I are going to talk about in the second half, my aim was not continuity driven, right? It's not like I was saying, I want to understand every single beat of the history of the New 52 Superman. That was really not. I was really just trying to get a sense of the character.
Who he is, yeah.
Who he is. And I feel like between Origin, between Unchained, between the Superman Wonder Woman arc, Darkseid War, I do feel like, and again, what we're going to talk about in the second half with the Grant Morrison and Greg Pak runs, I feel like I've gotten that sense, and part of me wishes I had not been so close-minded when this first started, but at the same time, I think I got more out of it now, so it all works out.
Yeah, and you probably did get more out of it now, especially because after hearing you go through all these different versions of the character and like understanding that there's so many wildly different takes on the character, and by nature of how American comics are made, they're all valid and they all appeal to different demographics and different generations, and just because you like one more than the other doesn't invalidate any other one. You know what I mean? Like I think that's important for people to remember, they're all cool. Well, one thing before I forget, I do love that in both these stories, I know you said you just want to see Superman kick ass, but for me, that's a huge part of why I like this. And because I listened to all your episodes on your podcast, and I've so many times, dude, almost every guest you have when you're talking about these stories says the phrase, I'm so happy to see a story where Superman has to use his brain instead of his fists to solve the problem. And it's like, I feel like that is every Superman story. Like every Superman story ends with him like outthinking the bad guy, right? And like, because I think every writer has this notion that, no one can fight Superman. He's the most powerful person. So it would be really interesting to see him use his brain. But everybody does that. So I feel like that's almost every Superman story is that. And I like that this just took the notion that Superman's powerful, but this is fiction. Let's just make someone who's more powerful. It's not I love seeing him actually fight and be a hero, like an action hero. Because I feel like I said, that as a kid was the stuff that I just loved. And now as an adult, when I'm trying to recapture my youth reading comic books, that's the stuff I want to see, So, I mean, that's the imagination fuel for me is just the action part of it. And I know that that's not for you. I know it's not the same thing, but I like that it was fully represented in these stories, balanced with the heart of the character as well, because I don't want to see the heart go away, but I just want to see him still be use all his powers and do cool stuff.
Well, I mean, that's a good point, that maybe sometimes there is a little bit of overcorrection, right? Where writers don't want to lean too heavily on the powers, but then that means that you don't have as many of those moments. And then when you do get them, they really do stand out. So I think too, I mean, it just, and that's why I also think that Darkseid is a fitting antagonist, boss level villain, because how many adversaries pose that, that high of a threat.
Well, see, that's why I liked Wraith, because I want new ones. I want so badly to see with writers in the future just come up with new characters, new intergalactic threats, new aliens, new freaks of science, new anything. I feel like the imagination is the limit. You can make characters that are stronger than Superman, and have him struggle fighting them and figure out ways to win. Use his brain to figure out, he did with Wraith. He didn't just pummel Wraith into the ground. He still had to think about how to beat him, but it wasn't like in Superman 2 where he tricks him into a doorway and flicks a button and takes away his powers. It was more visually what's the word I'm looking for? Exciting.
It was, and kind of, the one of the big set pieces of Unchained that comes to mind is I think when they're in Dubai, right? And I think it's when Superman's facing off against that Ascension terrorist group, and they've taken over this construction robot, for lack of a better term, right? Yeah. And the tallest building in the world is falling, and Clark is counting down the seconds right before it falls, and he's trying to save the building and keeping in mind the physics of all of it. So the mind, like he's still using his smarts while he's being attacked. And again, that was another one of those moments where, more so than usual for me, I really felt the tension of that action scene of I'm sure it's going to be okay, but I'm not quite sure how we're going to get there.
How you're going to get there, yeah.
And I felt, I think in that scene when he's trying to stop the space station in the first issue, and one of the big battles with Wraith, on the ocean floor, and then eventually Superman figures out, taking him to the Earth's core will, the magnetic core will neutralize some of the other, electromagnetic abilities that Wraith has. But in those instances, I really felt the tension, and especially in that Dubai scene where, in the narration, Clark is talking to himself. He's like, "All right, come on, Clark." Count. There's 4 seconds left. Again, as far as that relatability of it, it just felt that, and also the fact that he's younger, that could be a positive. I mean, I think there's an energy, there's a dynamic quality to the character that does add to the relatability. And those scenes in particular, I think, really spoke to that.
100%, dude. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Is there anything else you want to say about the stories we read, or any we didn't, or anything that we didn't get to?
Oh man, I mean, I'm okay. Really quick, I just want to shout out, off memory, because I didn't reread any of this, but I remember there was a Scott Lobdell arc in the Superman main title that was pretty cool. I think Kenneth Rockford was the artist, where he fights a new villain called Hell, which was pretty cool. There was the Greg Pak run with Aaron Kuder, which was really good. And there's John Romita Jr., Geoff Johns run, which is really good. So just shouting these out for listeners, if you haven't read the New 52, off the top of my head, these were story arcs that I had a lot of fun reading, and had great art, and on top of what we discussed here, if you want to dive into New 52, if any of this sounded interesting to you, definitely recommend checking it out, because it's a lot of fun. And if you go into it accepting that this is just a younger, different version of the character, you should be good to go. If you can separate that this is not the same continuity, just for your own sake, just say it's an ultimate Superman or whatever, you should have so much fun reading these books. They're really great.
Well said. And that was definitely the key to it for me, was just reading it in a vacuum, not worrying about its place, the fact that it supplanted, quote unquote, my Superman. And even that, like we've been talking about, what is my Superman? I guess the Triangle era into the Loeb Kelly era. That's the sweet spot for me, right? But what I recognize is, I mean, even if you look at all of the Triangle era and that Loeb Kelly period, I mean, you're talking a decade-ish.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things.
Very small part of the character.
It's a small part of the character's history. And so, yes, in my heart, will I sort of always think of that first when I think of Superman in the comics? Sure. Just as when I think of Superman on screen, I'm always going to think of Tom Welling first.
Yeah.
but it's not, at least now, thankfully, it's not at the point where that precludes me from enjoying something else. I recognize that. I guess too, it's all relative, right? When you start reading comics in the early 90s as a little kid, that's all I know. So then when you introduce these new elements, it takes you out of it. But taking that wider view, it's like, oh, okay, I get what we're doing here.
Totally. Oh, last thing I want to say is Jim Lee's art in these two books. This is I think the apex of him, man. This is everything that you love, that readers loved about his X-Men work and Batman Hush, and even the Superman arc that he did with Brian Azzarello for Tomorrow. I feel like Justice League and Unchained was the pinnacle of it, the rendering and the storytelling and the dynamics and how he draws motion and how he lays out panels. He's just at his absolute top of his game in these two books, and Scott Williams inking him and Alex Sinclair coloring him. To me, this is when I think American comic books, this is what they look like to me, because there's this they just look fun and dynamic and bright, but still real to a certain degree, but not so real. They kind of have a toy, action figure quality to it. It's just, to me, perfect when I think of comic book art.
Well said, man. That was definitely a huge draw, no pun intended, And really, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, I gravitated to those stories in particular, it was really a great representation of the character and this whole world. So thank you for joining me for this part of the double feature. Where can people find and follow you, and what are you working on these days?
So I'm working on Death Shroud still. We will have release info for it pretty soon. We're going to have almost 10 issues done before it even comes out. So there'll be no delays when it ships, thankfully. And I've got a page when this is released. I'm going to have Rob Liefeld is remastering Prophet #1 and Brigade #1. So he's getting artists to do he's getting a different artist to do every page to reinterpret those pages. So I've got a page in both of those books. So Prophet's coming out in June. I'm not sure when they're coming out, but they're coming out soon. I think the pre-orders just came out. So look out for Prophet Remastered #1 and Brigade Remastered #1. I'll have a page in both of those. So that was pretty cool. And I'm working on Death Shroud, and that's coming along really great. And it's going to be super cool. And you can follow me at V Ken Marion on Instagram and at V Ken Marion on Twitter. And I think that's all my plugs. I'm trying to remember. I don't want to forget something, but as soon as we sign off, I'm like, I forgot that too. So.
No, awesome, man. I hope everyone checks out Ken's stuff. And Ken, thank you so much. It's always, it's been a while since we've done one of these. It's always a blast. I always enjoy talking to you. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me, man. It's been a ton of fun to chat with you about this.
Awesome. All right. Our double feature continues with Ralph Puma. We'll be discussing the Grant Morrison and Greg Pak runs on Action Comics in the New 52 era. We will get right into that after this break. We'll be right back. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I was fortunate enough to have my work shown at these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and currently under new ownership, Moose sells a wide selection of new and old comics from every publisher, action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP, that's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order, and it helps support the show. Thank you. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Skokie, Illinois, Muncie, Indiana, or Harrison, New York, which happens to be my local comic shop. If you have kids and are looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Aw Yeah. And we're back into the second half of our double feature here, tagging in for Ken to discuss the Action Comics runs by Grant Morrison and Rags Morales, as well as Greg Pak and Aaron Kuder, his returning guest, and one of the biggest Morrison fans I know, Ralph Puma. Welcome back, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to tear into these.
Yes, especially in this case where this is a piece of Morrison's bibliography, but also, one of the pillars of the New 52 era. So I think it'll give us a lot to talk about. Now, let me say, my original plan was really to just do the Morrison piece of Action Comics. So Morrison wrote issues 1 through 18, as well as issue 0. And that was really all I was going to cover from Action Comics. And one of my patrons, shout out to Josh, was like, I hope you're not just going to do the Morrison run. It was like reading my mind. I was like, I kind of was. And then hand in hand with that, I put out a call on Twitter and I was like, hey, like what else do people recommend? I didn't know to what extent I would work it into the episode, but I was just curious what people thought about this era generally. What's the best of this period? And the Greg Pak Aaron Kuder run came up over and over and over again on Twitter. And I was like, all right, well, I have to check this out. So we ended up doing those 2 runs, which make up the bulk of this series of Action Comics. The big picture question for you, especially this Morrison run, we'll start with that. I mean, how did it work for you, especially upon reread and in the context of Morrison's larger bibliography? Because I know, for you in particular, I know what a fan you are. I mean, does this live up to their other work? Does it stand shoulder to shoulder? Did it not work as well? Like, what's your overall impression of this run?
I think it did. I think they fit all of their themes that they like to talk about into it, and the way that they played with time, and the way that within 18 issues they were able to kind of fit the entire character's history and almost kind of like knock away the New 52 mandate of everything's different. Like, the entire Superman mythos is happening, and it's all happening now, even down to the Red Skies in Final Crisis, when things start heating up in reality and the 2D world is starting to collapse.
Right on. Okay, so I don't know that our impressions are totally divergent, though I don't think I enjoyed the entirety of the run as much as you did. I'll say my big picture take on this was I really enjoyed that introductory arc, the t-shirt and jeans Superman, the golden age version of the character. And I say the first arc, but it was really like the first few issues.
Yeah.
Because very shortly, we Superman's in his traditional costume and all that. But those first few issues in particular that really drew from the original golden age iteration of the character, where he is this social crusader. I mean, in the opening page of Action Comics #1, he's, breaking up this shady business deal, and his first words are rats with money and guns. And it's like, oh my God, like, this is not the Superman we've grown accustomed to, but I loved the spirit of it. I love the energy of it. And so that part of the run was by far my favorite. It breaks my heart that version didn't live longer in the New 52. And in the first half of this double feature, I said that I do think one of the missteps with the New 52, rather than supplanting the existing continuity, I really think this should have been its own imprint, a la the Ultimate Universe at Marvel, right?
Absolutely.
And I say to myself, to this day, we could still be reading the t-shirt and jeans social crusader version of the character on the stands right next to Superman as a husband and a father in the mainline DCU. So I love getting to see that. And to your point, I did appreciate the extent to which, Morrison was able to really take us along the journey of Superman's history. Because you're right, even within that first arc, we get Brainiac and the Bottle City. We get a lot of those Silver Age concepts, right? So you're moving through Superman history. So that first arc worked for me very well. The next 10 issues left me pretty cold. I appreciated the long game that Morrison was playing. We'll unpack all of this, but they were planting seeds from the very first issue.
Oh yeah.
Right. All these little seeds that will pay off. I mean, essentially it comes down to, right, this the little short bespectacled man who's making deals with everyone as we move forward. And you see how it all ties together. And to your point, the idea of this villain attacking Superman simultaneously at various points in his timeline, that was clever and all that, but I just did not find myself tremendously invested. So, on balance, was this my favorite run? No, but those early issues earned a lot of goodwill from me. So, overall, I'm definitely glad I read it. I would definitely recommend, especially that first arc, to people. I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah, that was my favorite of the New 52. That first issue, when I read that one, I was so excited. Just him dangling Mr. Glenn Morgan over the edge and how much of a bruiser he was. It's every panel that Rags draws in that is a different Superman face. You can like pinpoint like, oh, there's George Reeves, there's Christopher Reeve. Like every single time he draws him, there's like a different facet of the character in the character's face and body language, and it's really like a beautiful homage, especially as you said, those first few issues. The whole arc, I think, really is. Morrison does want to fit in their more like Gnostic, mystic, psychonaut kind of themes, especially with what is it, Vindictivix, I think, is how you would pronounce it. That character is very representative of this like Gnostic ideal of the demiurge that kind of traps our souls here and is this false creator god. So it gets pretty heady, as everyone says about Morrison's work. But to be able to fit such a terrifying, massive entity that explains an aspect of masks in our reality is really fascinating to me into a Superman story.
Right on. So let's start at the beginning here. And, listeners know, because I covered a selection of stories from the Golden Age on the podcast last year and really just fell in love with it right away. That original iteration of the character before he became the symbol of the status quo. And, those early Golden Age stories are wild. I mean, he kills people. They're not explicit about it, but he throws some of the bad guys such distances that there's no way they survived.
Yeah.
So, he doesn't go as far here. But again, in that first page, the rats, and he's like, I'm your worst nightmare. And, he's able to get a confession out of Glenn Morgan using tactics that, again, you typically wouldn't expect to see from Superman. And again, he's in the t-shirt and jeans. He's not in the full costume yet. His power set is far more modest. Again, really going back to the beginnings of the character, not entirely dissimilar from what you would see in Superman the Animated Series, right? Where, show, they definitely scaled him back a little bit and made him sweat a little bit more. And I think you got kind of the spirit of that here as well. And it really just worked for me. He's at odds with law enforcement, which is typically not what you see with Superman. And that's something that I don't think I mentioned this in the conversation I did with Ken, but there was a moment in, I think it was the Justice League origin arc, where the military is attacking the Justice League and the parademons, right? They're having this big battle with the parademons and the military is just firing on everybody. They're all aliens, right? And they're just attacking all of them. And Superman goes up and he takes down the jets, and Diana is like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, they're abusing their authority. Like, they shouldn't be doing that. So that version of the character, and I really do think that this story was ahead of its time, because not that it was that long ago, but it was over 10 years ago. And what we have seen in our real world, and very recently, in terms of abuses of power generally, and we see that in so many different ways, to have a character like Superman to stand up against the bullies, to stand up for the people who are being taken advantage of, it's so powerful. And I do want to say, because I have not been current on it, but I am aware that the Superman Son of Kal-El series by Tom Taylor that's being published right now, my understanding is that John Kent in that series is more socially minded and is sort of delving into that territory. So I look forward to reading that, because I think that that's a fitting use of Superman. It's funny because I feel like we often talk about Superman's power, and I say we, I mean myself. Like we've talked about it on the podcast, and I've often framed it in terms of, well, like, should Superman rid the world of nuclear weapons, right? But that's such a large scale, question. What I like here is, this is much smaller in scale and in stakes in theory, but it's also so much more personal, right? And there's mention of him, standing up to an abusive husband, a la, some of the earliest Golden Age stories as well. So
yeah.
So I really I love that aspect, and I think again it brings this question of, how should Superman use his power, down to a very important, relatable, small scale. I love it.
I love the never give up and the swagger that this Superman has when he stands up and he's just wiping blood and he's smiling and he's like constantly saying, I think throughout this run, like, I'm not sure, but I'm going to try it. And then he like is constantly pushing his powers. We're in this like place of Superman coming up against all of these new things in his reality and just breaking those barriers.
Yeah. Oh, I love the attitude. And you're right. You do see that throughout the run. And in the battle with Brainiac, for example, a few issues in, there's a certain point where Clark is like, you don't get it. I don't stop. I don't give up. And it's just like, yeah, like this is the character. So yeah, I just that attitude, that spirit. Well, again, but it's still, that's the thing about this that is surprising to me, I suppose, because it could feel like such a departure from the Superman we know. And yeah, and some of the more superficial trappings, maybe it is, but I feel like at its core, it's still that goodness. It's still that unwillingness to relent. I think that maybe Superman is just a little bit more vocal about it. You know, I don't know, maybe in terms of the way he's expressing it, but it just, like I said, there's this energy and this dynamic quality to it that I think is so cool. And you know what's funny with this Golden Age-esque version of the character? It's crazy to me that this doesn't get utilized more because, to me at least, it seems to address all of the common criticisms of Superman. Now, I agree. I don't subscribe to these criticisms, just to be clear. That should be clear by now. But, you know, what are the things that people say about Superman? Oh, he's boring. You know, he's
too overpowered.
He's too powerful. You can't come up with credible threats. He's goody two shoes, like all that stuff. And you read these stories and it's like, no, like, you know, he is taken down by a train, right? A train off the tracks here. And again, doesn't always know the right thing to do. And can be at odds with you know, the authority. It's just, that's the thing. It's just odd to me that you don't see more of this because it really does seem to run right against what people often complain about when they talk about the character. You know, as far as especially those first issues, the look of the character and the way the character moves. I don't want to claim too much credit here because the trade paperback that I have of the first arc has the sketchbook at the back and some explanatory notes from Morrison and Morales. So I am parroting a bit of that. But, you know, they talked in those bonus features about how they really wanted to live up to the title of the book, Action, right? And really have this very like tactile, muscular action is the way they described it. And so you see, especially in those early issues, it's Superman versus the speeding train, like I said, or Superman versus the wrecking ball. It's, you know, he's not fighting, you know, waves of energy, right? It's like very, you know, very tangible. So I thought that was, you know, that was kind of cool to see play out.
Yeah, it feels like the cartoons, the early, like, I'm blanking on the
Fleischers.
Oh my, yes, it feels like the Fleischer cartoons. That there's such like beauty in like his poses and action and movements, and I feel like those first few issues are almost unrelenting until he gets hit with the bullet train. You know, those, I mean, that's only at the end of the first issue. That feels like so much happens in that, like,
yeah.
And as soon as he gets hit by that, then you're like, oh. And even as like a fan who reads Superman, like I have already read this, but still, that's a huge moment of just, you know, what you do to an unkillable man, you throw the world's biggest bullet at him, that Lex says.
Lex, now perfect that you're here for this because just a few episodes ago, you helped me close out my Lex event, and we talked about the ideologue version of Lex, who has this philosophical opposition to the character and so on. But you know, what do you make of the Lex here? Or I guess, what are your takeaways of this Lex? A very interesting depiction.
I mean, he absolutely fits in with all of the prior Lexes that we talked about. He's definitely more in the ideologue that we were talking about, Lex. He genuinely sees Superman as a viral infection. There's a lot of talk in this run about like the cuckoo and like, you know, cuckoo birds like go or, you know, leave their baby in another nest. The bird awakens and eats all the other ones and then has the mom feed them. So it's like this like really like vicious like idea of like, this is an alien invader. They're not overtly invading us, but there's something up there. There's something out there that's coming. I see it. I've looked. I can see it coming, and we have this thing on our planet that might be part of that. So this is obviously an invasion. So he's working from a complete, place of fear. And anyone who denies a conscious being, I think, is kind of already in some kind of moral gray territory. Like, Lex could have had a conversation with Superman to sort this out, but Lex doesn't even want that. He's very much like it, and he corrects everybody throughout it. It. Not he, it.
Yes, that definitely jumps out. It's interesting, especially knowing where the New 52 Lex goes, because not too long after this, I mean, I guess it's a long period of time since we're starting, 5 years earlier with Morrison's first arc, but in the grand scheme of the New 52, it's not too long after this that Lex has his heroic turn in Forever Evil and becomes part of the Justice League. It's kind of crazy. But looking at where he started here, I mean, I guess a couple of things that I clocked, he's a little bit pudgier at the beginning, he's not the Lex of the Triangle era who looked almost like Kingpin in various issues. But he's definitely not at the peak of physical condition that we'll see, that we do see in other versions of the character. He's chugging the energy.
He has a bit of like a 45, 50-year-old middle manager with like a Jeff Bezos kind of Lex.
Yeah. And he's chugging the energy drinks and everything. And he's kind of, to be blunt, like kind of like a little bitch, like especially when when things go down, like he's always the first to run, or you know what I mean? He definitely doesn't have that commanding presence that I think we've come to associate with Lex in the beginning here.
I think he does in some moments, right? So when he's in the military room, he obviously thinks he's got power over these jugheads. He's the smartest person in this room. But when he is faced with this like brazen alien that is against all of his ideals, or at least his overt ideals that he presents himself to be as, the money man, the business and power and, backhanded deals and secrecy and all of that. Like, there's this ideal that is completely against everything just running at you. He's going to be terrified. He's
true. No, that's fair. I also have to say Lex gives us a moment that genuinely made me laugh. And that, that doesn't happen for me a lot when I'm reading comics, but when he's questioning Superman, and I gotta say, it was tough to see Superman in that position. He gets taken by the government. He's strapped to a chair. He's electrocuted. I mean, of course he ultimately makes his way out, but, they really have him against the ropes, it seems, for a time there. But
it's very reminiscent of almost the Darwin Cooks, how they treat like all the Martians in that. It has that like CIA 1950s like kind of like vibe in those moments. For
sure. But when he questions Superman about his true form, he's like, what do you really look like? And he shows him the deformed calf, and Clark laughs. It was so funny to me. And, I had read these issues before, so I knew that in a subsequent issue, we would get a story from the perspective of the rocket ship that brought Kal-El to Earth. And we would see that when he landed in Smallville, Jonathan and Martha were transporting this deformed calf and ended up putting it to divert suspicion, right? They left the rocket with the calf inside with the military, right? And so like that's what they think came out of the rocket. It's so funny. It's genuinely funny.
It's such a good moment. Like, and you could see like the rage and Lex. He's like, "What are you doing? Don't do that. Don't laugh at me." It's so good.
Yeah, it's really terrific. It's also, going back to this idea of the Golden Age-esque Superman, this depowered man of the people. What's fascinating to me is, in by issue 3, I think the word is out that Superman is an alien, and yes, that does change the way people view him. But initially, and I'm thinking about, I guess it's the first issue, right, where he's saving the people in the housing development that's in the middle of this battle here.
Where Lex specifically attacks a low-income neighborhood?
Yes. And, but the people like rally around him. This version of the character really is more a man of the people. And it's interesting because when we talk about Luthor, the ideologue, we talk about the Snyder movies or even something like Birthright, stories that get at how would the world react to this character. I think there are two components. There is the alien side, right? We cannot dismiss that. But I think even more than that, it's this idea of power. One person having this much power, what do you do with that? And so that's why it's so fascinating to me when we look at the depowered Superman, because I feel like that part of the equation isn't really there. It's just interesting. It's a different spin on it, right? Because this, like the Superman of the first few issues of Action Comics here couldn't really destroy the world. You know what I mean? Like so it just changes that dynamic. And I like that man of the people aspect of the character. And even the uniform, like, did you like the t-shirt and jeans look?
I love it. I like that it gets dirty and he's just so working class and, as you said, just a man of the people. It's such a... When I first read that, I was like, yes, this is my Superman. I want to claim this is like the one that... But it didn't last long enough, as like we've seen. And I think there's really something to it, but it's a part of his history now. I don't like that there really is a separation between, this Superman and who he becomes with the kids. I think that it should all be the same, because this Superman has such a like Superboy, like it's this should have been like the hot off the heels of Smallville. Like it feels like it fits, like that Superman, the rats with wings. It feels like that Superman that just got inspired by Batman and finally is starting to put together his costume from the Max Landis, like American Alien. It just has like, it fits in everywhere in his history, that there doesn't have to be this separation. It doesn't have to be gone or different,
Yeah. I mean, I love that you mentioned Smallville, because that's, I think that's one of the reasons why I gravitated towards this t-shirt and jeans look, because that's what Clark wore. It's even even in the final seasons, season 9, he had the trench coat, but you take that trench coat off, it's still a t-shirt and jeans. And so I think that's why I was even more responsive to this version of the character. This is a tangent, but it makes me wish that, on Smallville, in those final seasons, he was taking more of an active and proactive role in operating in Metropolis. But, he still largely did it from the shadows and at super speed. And I kind of wish we had gotten to see stories on the show where, he was out there, but maybe it was a look like we have in, like, he doesn't have to be in the costume per se.
No.
So I really like the look. I really like the white t-shirt. I like the blue one too, of course, but the white one I really like that one. And I love the couple of stories, and in particular Action Zero, right? Where you see him at the copy store, like ordering these shirts in bulk.
And they're like, well, we've only got red, white, and blue. And he's like, great. That's like, I love that. And how this guy is telling this beautiful story about Superman coming in and ordering it and saving it. And then they walk outside and they're like, you're really going to fall for that? And every single store is selling Superman t-shirts.
It's great. What do you make of the cape and the cape's properties, right? The fact that because in that Action Comics #0 story, this kid gets a hold of it and is able to use it for protection. Did you like that?
I do. It's like this mystical cape. It's the magician's, thing of power, and it's also kind of like Superman's baby blanket. He's got his protection blankie with him all the time. It might seem kind of like soft and weird, but I really like that aspect. I wanted to actually talk about the Superman t-shirt and the S and how it kind of resolves his whole, secret identity crisis that he has. If you were to go out in that shirt and stand on the corner and put the Superman pose, what are people going to call you? They're not going to say, hey, Anthony. They're going to say, hey, Superman. And so even if he was caught as Clark wearing a Superman shirt, no one's going to buy that Clark Kent is Superman, because everybody wants to dress up or be Superman.
Yeah, that is actually a really good point. Yeah, I know. Again, I really like the look. I know, Ken and I talked about the full armored costume look that he gets. And I know Ken was very high on it. I like it a lot too, but yeah, there's something really special about the t-shirt and jeans look. So I'm a fan of that.
Well, I like that the armor is needed for like some elements, right? So like, he's gonna be in his normal t-shirt and jeans because that's easiest to like pull on and pull off. To put on this whole armored suit or hide this whole armored suit underneath his, street clothes, that doesn't seem really feasible. We also get the radiation suit as well. Steel built him that radiation suit from the animated series.
Yeah, let's talk about John Henry Irons for a second here. And this was actually a question from one of our patrons, shout out to Brian, who asked, how do we feel about the fact that Morrison utilizes John Henry early on in the story, and then, we don't see him after that. We do see him in the Greg Pak run, so he does come back. But
yeah,
how did you feel about that? I guess I'll toss it to you first.
I would have liked more of John Henry. I love that character so much. Still haven't seen the Steel movie that you and Ken love. I really got to check it out. But a lot of stuff moves very quickly in most of Morrison's comics. So, we lose track of certain elements. I wish that there would have been more of him near the end helping out in some way.
Yeah, same here. No, I mean, this is a larger conversation, and we'll do a whole Steel spotlight in the future. So we'll talk more about Steel. But I guess, it begs the question: what is the essence of the Steel character? And I think at a minimum, it's this this brilliant engineering mind who wants to help, right? And I think that's at the core of any of the Steel stories that you look at, including the movie where the Superman element is completely removed, right? But he's still someone who's trying to help. So that's, I think, always the ultimate foundation. But then this question of being inspired by Superman and how much of a core of the character is that piece of it. And if you go back to his first appearance, it's like that's everything, right? He was inspired by Superman and Superman's death, and ends up becoming this character. So when you introduce him earlier in the story, and especially in a story divorced from the death of Superman, I think it still works. I mean the death of Superman fan in me, likes the version where he steps up after Superman dies. But I think a version like this still works. Very similar to what we got in Superman the Animated Series, right? Where he's working for Lex, and he develops a suit of armor, and he becomes an ally of Superman. So I think any of the versions kind of work. But yeah, it still takes a little getting used to for me, to introduce him at this point in the story.
Well, I think Steel has evolved over the years to kind of stand on his own. I think that
that's a fair point.
He doesn't necessarily need the Superman mythos to survive as he is. I love that they're making him one of these people vying for military contracts. He's one of the most brilliant minds in the DC universe, and he's pretty much the DC universe's like actual Iron Man.
True. No, I like that. I appreciate that take on it for sure. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, but in the Greg Pak run later on in Action Comics, he develops this relationship with Lana Lang, which I love.
I love that.
Oh, yeah. I love that. And I know that continues into the Rebirth. I love that so much. Which I think is great. We'll talk more about that. But it was cool to see John Henry. I wish he had played more of a role. I'm glad he came back in those later issues for sure. Again, even though it's not my favorite part of the run, I do want to get into the, go past this introductory arc of Morrison's. But, like we were saying before, we move from the sort of the gold into the silver age within those first few issues with the introduction of Brainiac and the Bottle City and Superman donning this armor, the traditional, the more traditional Superman costume, and also finally learning about where he comes from.
How great of a movie would this one make, though? Like, if you were to just see like this, like I would say to the end of the Brainiac thing, people don't necessarily need to know about all of the fifth dimensional stuff. I love it. I think it's great as someone, who wants to see like fresh things happening with 2D, 3D space and exploring like how, what happens in the 2D space will affect our world and vice versa. That's fascinating for me. But if you were to take those like first 8 issues, and that's a solid Superman movie, you get everything.
Yeah. Oh, I co-sign on that. I'm on board with that totally. Yeah, no, I think that would be really cool. It's, and this sort of plays into my preferences when it comes to the origin tellings of the character. and this is just a matter of preference. I think you can make an argument either way. I really do. I like when Clark is able to uncover his origins on his own first before becoming Superman. I don't really love these versions where it's a villain who's kind of cluing him in to where he comes from. And even my favorite version of the origin, Birthright, does that, where Lex is the one who sort of downloads him on Krypton and everything. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but I just, part of me feels like it's this unnecessary layer of cruelty that he's learning about where he comes from by an adversary. And maybe it's just loving the character so much that I feel like, hey, just give this guy a break. Like let him have this like a pure moment of discovery on his own about where he comes from before he takes this next step forward. Like I said, it's just a matter of preference. I see both sides of it, but that's sort of what I feel.
Well, what about the tragedy when Neil deGrasse Tyson shows him his planet explode?
Yeah, that was a little goofy. That was one of the backup stories, right?
Yeah, no, I love that. I just think it was just like, oh man, that hurts.
Yes.
Like, oh, I finally get to see Krypton. It's just this image of like the planet exploding.
Yes. I will say though, for a second there, I thought that, when we were dealing with the Brainiac portion of the story and, he shrinks a portion of Metropolis and Superman has to rescue them. That's where he ends up on Brainiac's ship. I loved him launching himself into space.
Yeah.
And again, this is a very depowered Superman. So that was quite the feat. And he needs the oxygen mask and everything. Like, I thought that was a great touch. And
that ultimatum between Krypton and just how like cold Brainiac is about it, where Brainiac's just like, yeah, let's see. Do you want to save Krypton or do you want to save Metropolis? What will the alien, the man out of his own species, do? And like, I genuinely feared for Kandor in that moment because, it's the New 52. This is a silly idea, small shrunken city. They could just smash that away and it'll be gone. So there were genuine stakes there.
Yes, no, for sure.
For the character emotionally as well as,
And look, in fairness to DC, I mean, I think maybe that, that's one of the things with the New 52 is that you could have moments like that where it's more unpredictable, right? You don't know. I mean, of course, yeah, Superman's able to save them all, but, you don't know that at that moment in time. And there's something to be said for that. But, for a second, I thought we were going into this territory of, Brainiac being responsible for the destruction of Krypton. Or some entity being responsible, which I've talked about on the show. I don't love that. I really prefer for this to be an avoidable natural occurrence. That to me is the best version of Krypton being destroyed. I don't love the Bendis Rogol-Zar business where, he's in the planet's core making this happen. I don't like that. So I was glad that we were able to, there was a mention of the fact that this was, ended up befalling Krypton on its own. So just as a side note, when we talk about the origin stuff, that's the version I prefer, I suppose.
This Superman is so smart too. He like not only saves both cities, though I do have a question. Was he smashing other bottled cities at some point? Does he like break like one or two and is just kind of callous about it?
Maybe. I mean, I think there was a lot going on in that battle. I don't know.
There was like, I think he like kind of like whacks one and like Brainiac is like, wait, what are you doing? It's, but he manages to save both his like cities and redeem Brainiac, basically turning him into the first Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I liked him using the ship as his little hideaway. I thought that was a cool touch. And I really like him using the shrunken rocket ship as this bullet against Brainiac that allows him to take over. I thought that was a neat bit as well.
Yeah, just when like the crystals start forming from like, it's really, really cool.
Yeah, no, like again, I really think that first arc is very, very strong, and again gives you that very dynamic, energetic Superman who is going to stand up to any bully. And that's one of the things that we get, Shali Fish is the writer who pens these backup stories in the Morrison issues. And I think there's one of them with the Kents, right, where Clark is getting advice from Jonathan, and it's all about standing up to bullies, and
Yep.
that really, I think, frames this whole iteration of the character, especially in these first few issues, of this guy who's going to stand up to anyone who is putting someone else down. And again, I think that's, I don't think that's disconnected from other versions of the character, but I think the way it's really played up here, it works to great effect. And
what do you think about that Legion issue? That's kind of, it seems it gives you so much right away. And Legion stories to me should always kind of have this feeling of like, wait, what are they talking about? Because you're reading people from centuries in the future. So there should always be this kind of element of like, wait, what is this thing? What is this technology? How does this work? There should always be that element. But in the middle of this run, to introduce that is really difficult to kind of concept and comprehend. I love it, but like, casual readers, just like one out of the month, and that's the monthly issue that you get, that's a hard read.
It is. And what's interesting is that, so I have the trade that's called Superman and the Men of Steel. Superman and the Men of Steel. That's the trade that I have. And that adds the Rocket issue and the Legion issue at the end. But I believe that they came out like in the middle of that first arc. I think due to the lateness on the art, I believe. So which is interesting. It reads much better in the trade than I imagine it did if you were reading them in issue number order.
Yeah.
For sure.
Because it comes out of like it definitely fits, and it's really cool to have like this like Legion working side by side. So you know that this is going on, right? So it kind of already inputs into your head that not only is there this, regular comic book arc, but there's this overarching arc that we're going to see throughout all of it. So it's cool to see that, but for it really comes out of nowhere, and you're like, wait, what's happening? How? And you kind of got to like catch yourself, which is cool. I think it's different than any like, comic book usually goes and makes you think. And I just am looking at it from, someone who's reading a single issue, and then you're expecting like the big moment and you get that, and it's really confusing.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I guess that's a good jumping off point to the second half of Morrison's run and the Greg Pak stuff as well. Real quick, I just want to say I really do like in the New 52 how Lois is utilized. As much as my heart is always with Lois and Clark as the romantic pairing, I really like this version of them as friends and allies. But I want to say I really dig Morrison's take on Jimmy. The fact that they're genuinely buddies. And there's some fun stuff in Action Zero, I believe, where they're playing video games and talking about movies. And Jimmy makes reference to like, oh yeah, you grew up on a farm. Like there's not much else to do but watch movies. This notion that Clark is out there on the farm and he's just watching all of these movies and he has all of these film references. As a film fan myself, like was really cool. And it also just rings true. It's like, yeah, it's probably, I don't know, like that doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
So I like
He's not just, I think that Lois and Jimmy both kind of know as well. I have this like reading these, Jimmy and Lois kind of give this vibe that they know that he's Superman.
So while not assigned for this, I did read the Truth, most of the Truth arc across both Superman. So I did read a little bit of Superman. I read a few issues. Okay. And a bit past the Greg Pak issues that were assigned, that delve into this portion of the New 52 where Superman's identity is uncovered. And it's actually even in the Men of Tomorrow arc by Johns and Romita where Clark reveals his identity to Jimmy. And then the Truth arc, Lois finds out. And Lois is ultimately the one who spills the beans to the world because Clark is being leveraged by this criminal syndicate. Anyway, that's a whole other piece of it. But so I don't know, do the stories support your thesis? I don't know literally, but in spirit, yes, I agree. I like that. I think that, look, whenever we talk about the secret identity, it's one of those things where, you want the characters to have integrity. And so if they're not putting these things together, it's not a great reflection on anyone, right? On Clark for keeping the secret, on them for not being able to piece it together. So no, I subscribe to, to your version, even if it's, I don't know if you can literally draw that line, but it's like, nah, I'm with you.
The Calvin Ellis story is really cool. I really enjoy that take on Superman, and the villain, just this evil tulpa of Superman corrupted by marketing, is so like at that time period on the nose with like what they were doing with Injustice and kind of how they saw the character outside of like, you know, the comic book iterations. It's how I initially saw Man of Steel, was like, oh man, these people are trying to make this like awful version of him. Not that I feel that way now, but back when I initially had watched it. And just how terrifying that dictator like Superman is.
Yeah, that was...
We get him...
No, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, you go.
You get it with like Homelander, you get it in Invincible, you get it with all these other like versions of Superman, and even Injustice Superman is that way. But to have it be the idea of Superman created by Clark, Jimmy, and Lois, and then they sell it, and it becomes this like ultra corporate like dictator, it's terrifying.
Yes. Yeah, no, for sure. No, that issue was fun. I figured you would like that. A little bit of the Morrison multiversity action there. No, that was cool. Look, when we get into the second half of the Morrison run, again, I know you were on board. This was where it started to lose me. In broad strokes, what we ultimately get is this revelation that, in the fifth dimension, Mxyzptlk has this rival, Vindictivix, or however you say it. And who is sort of usurped in his role within the fifth dimension by Mixie, and sets his sights on Superman and attacks him across time. And we get to a point where in these issues, we're seeing simultaneous attacks at different points in time. And going back to what we were saying before about the seeds that Morrison planted, really across these 19 issues that Morrison wrote of Action Comics, you see this, again, this little bespectacled man making deals with the anti-Superman army and Glenn Morgan and various characters. So you see that this was the long game that Morrison was playing. I guess I just found myself, and I don't say this to be dismissive, but just not really caring. And it wasn't, because I really did some self-reflection here. And I said to myself, am I not getting it? And I'm getting frustrated. And it's like, no, did I get every nuance of what Morrison was doing? No, I'm sure there were things that I missed, but I genuinely believe I grasped the broad strokes of it, but I just didn't necessarily feel much of an emotional connection. Now, with one exception, those issues do deal a good bit with the Kents, and we haven't really talked about this yet, especially in this half of the double feature, but the fact that the Kents are dead in the New 52, and we start to get a lot more about that in these final Morrison issues. And that was one aspect that I was able to latch onto. But I want to talk about these issues, but I also just want to, by means of contrast, I'm really glad we read the Greg Pak issues, because these allow me to articulate the way I'm feeling about this by way of example, which I think is always the best way. And the audience knows, the magic and or supernatural Superman stories are generally not my favorite. They never have been. That really hasn't changed over the course of doing this podcast. Are there some Mixie stories that I like? Sure. I thought the animated series did a great job with him, but by and large, those are not the stories that really light my fire. But if there's something that I can really latch onto from an emotional standpoint, from a character standpoint, I will get on board. And so reading those Morrison issues with the fifth dimension and Vindictivix and all of that business, I'm not saying it wasn't there. Maybe it was, but I didn't really find something to latch onto to really make me invest. Now, by contrast, you get to the Greg Pak issues, and so you and I read basically 10 issues worth before and after the Doomed arc. So we read the issues dealing with those subterranean quote unquote monsters. And then we also read the haunting of Smallville issues that ultimately dealt with the Phantom Zone, but basically Smallville being haunted, for lack of a better term. So, while both stories have, I guess, ultimately have sci-fi explanations, they really play more as supernatural / horror stories. Yeah. Which, again, not my favorite. However, both stories are really anchored by Clark's relationship with Lana and memories of his parents.
Yeah.
And I really responded to those stories, even though on paper, the trappings of them don't necessarily grab me.
It's something is wrong in Superman's mythos, right? Because the Kents are gone, something is inherently wrong in Superman's mythos. It's even like stated explicitly somewhere. I think the landlady says it. I like that this fifth dimensional being is taking care of Superman kind of quietly, because her lover was his like love to prank this guy pretty much. And you know, they happen outside of time. They're supposed to be above even us, right? So you know, these characters are two-dimensional, but they see themselves as three-dimensional. Where, you know, three-dimensional beings, well, we're technically four-dimensional beings because we're time, so but we see ourselves as three-dimensional. And then you can get into the fifth-dimensional stuff, which is supposed to be like aliens, angels, demons. All that stuff is like what fifth-dimensional beings are meant to represent. So to have these characters like taking interest in these two-dimensional beings and wanting to influence their lives and make sure the continuity is correct and that they remember how things are is really kind of interesting.
With the Nixley, the landlady, right? What was interesting to me about that was, and I wanted to talk about this fact that the Kents are not alive. I mean, we talked about this in the first half, but I think it's even more prevalent here in these Morrison issues and then in the Greg Pak issues. What's interesting about Nixley is that I feel like she sort of fills in where the Kents normally would, right? When the Superman action is done and he goes home and he has, you know, he's sort of unpacking everything and he has these moments, these heart-to-hearts. You know, we don't have the Kents here, but we have Nixley. Now, part of me wonders, well, does that help prove that we really should have the Kents there? Because, like, if there's this function that needs to be served and the Kents aren't there, we have to utilize this other character. Yeah. I don't know. That might be a valid question. But I guess big picture, where do you land on this question of whether or not the Kents should be alive at this stage of Clark's journey?
He's always had the farm. He's always had Ma there. She's kind of in stasis in this place, and to take that away from him is to take away his stability, to take away his base. It's very intentional that was done, you know, to kind of set this character down not a more destructive path, but he's a little angrier. I think this Clark, he's a little bit more lost than I think he would be had he had the farm and Ma. This sets up, without this bit here of like this kind of lost, he doesn't have Ma and Pa, and that being kind of the focus of all of this, to then go back to Smallville and it be this really bizarre kind of town later on, which is how I think Smallville works best. Like, it has to have this Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, sci-fi. That's where I think like late Smallville works best. I mean, even the show has like those Twilight Zone-y kind of like, you know, the person utilized the kryptonite, they got hungry with power and they suffered a horrible fate. It's very Twilight Zone. It has those 50s sci-fi horror elements. And I think that's where Smallville kind of works best for me, because it's scary to go back to your old home and it's all different, you know, and people treat you different and you're kind of this outsider now.
Now, I do think, in fairness, a story like Superman for All Seasons, for example, was able to show that Clark, you know, can have those feelings of not fitting in when he returns after having left Smallville, yet Ma and Pa are still there. So I think you could still sort of have that dynamic. But, you know, your point is well taken. And look, I always try to keep as open a mind as possible. And so in reading these stories, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so if Ma and Pa are not there, yes, I like the stories where they are. But if they're not, like, what effect does that have? How does that shape the character? And I don't disagree with you that maybe there's some, you know, more of an anger, an underlying anger with the character, and that would be understandable. Losing your parents in that way at that age, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I also feel, and I don't mean to say this to spin it as a positive, but I guess the other effect that I kind of see is that there's more of a freedom to the character because he's not tied to anything. Not that the Kents held him back or anything like that, but just that he is truly on his own in a way that you don't typically see. So I think there's a freedom to the character that does, there is value to that. I can see that.
Would a Clark who still had Ma and Pa kill off Clark Kent?
No, right, exactly. Right, when he has this when he has this Kraven the Hunter-esque assassin Nimrod going after him, and Clark Kent is caught in this explosion. He decides to retire the Clark Kent identity, becomes Johnny Clark, a firefighter. Very short-lived. That was an interesting little blip there in the Morrison run.
But it's like one of the effects that this like little interdimensional demon basically has caused. There would be no moment of panic where Clark's like, I guess Clark Kent's dead. Like, he doesn't know how to solve that problem yet.
Yeah,
he doesn't. I think this might have even been the first time he's faced with like Clark Kent was genuinely murdered. People saw it. There were witnesses. How do I get around this?
Yeah, I did like Batman making the case to Clark about his reporting and the effect that has had, and why Clark Kent needs to come back.
And then drop in the little tracker on him.
Yes. Well, he's still Batman. And then Nixley, the landlady, uses her wish to make everyone forget that Clark Kent had died. But
yeah.
Yeah, again, it's just this interesting thing. What I also find very fascinating about this era of Superman is, of course, pre-Crisis, the Kents were dead. Now, I've only really scratched the surface in terms of reading pre-Crisis stories. I readily admit that. But from what I have read, I could be totally wrong here, but I don't get the sense that there were a ton of stories of Clark really recalling specific memories with his parents or the lessons that they had taught him. Maybe there are, but I never quite got that sense. And so that's what's kind of, and I don't think stories of that era were really concerned with that per se. And so that's what I think is kind of interesting about the New 52 era. So if you're going to tell stories where the Kents are dead, you can have Clark explore their memories and their influence, again, in a way that pre-Crisis, maybe you didn't get to see. So I can appreciate that opportunity, and you do get plenty of instances, and especially as we move into the Greg Pak issues, Clark has this memory of his heat vision kicking in and burning this field, and and Pa a little unsure of how to handle this, but ultimately comforting him. And Clark even says at one point, he's like, he hugged me even though I could have cut him in half with my heat vision. And so it's a different spin on the Kents, because they're still there, but in a different way.
Well, when you lose a parent, like, everything comes into hyper focus, right? You remember all of the aspects. You remember the good, you remember the bad. It's all right there. So this is a Clark that's grieving, like, present stuff. He doesn't have as much connection to Krypton. He is grieving present stuff. And I even think that also does play a part in him killing Clark Kent, because he wants nothing to do with Clark Kent. Clark Kent's full of grief. Clark Kent is this. Superman has power. Superman is this. I don't want to be Clark. I don't want to like think about Smallville. I want to be Superman. He has like that moment. And I think that's such that issue at least is so well done. And it's all kind of hazy, but I'm forgetting if that's this in that issue is when he goes to the Justice League about the hamsters.
Oh yeah.
Where he like calls together a Justice League meeting and he's like, well, if no one's taking care of the hamsters, can we at least try and solve poverty in Somalia? That was another like laugh out loud moment for me.
Yes. Yeah, that was an interesting bit about about their role, right? And is it just to respond to alien invasions, or is it to try to, affect more meaningful change, right? At a more local, personal level.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to, underserve the Morrison issues. I want to get back to that, because I know, again, especially with the Fifth Dimension stuff, I know you responded to that. But while we're talking about the Kents, just a quick side note, in the Geoff Johns Justice League run, in the Villain's Journey arc, Clark makes a mention at a certain point about not being able to save his father from a heart attack. And then, of course, in the Morrison run, we get this we get the backstory of how the Kents died in this car accident. It seemed like a bit of an inconsistency there, although I guess, maybe technically you can argue, because, there's this, scene where, Pa wants to pass at home. So Clark brings him there, and maybe ultimately the cause of death was a heart attack resulting from the injuries in the car. It seems though, like there was a little bit of, this wasn't totally thought out in any event. In the Morrison issues, we do get to see how the Kents, die as a result of this car accident they're in. There's a very heavy implication that Vindictivix, who was there in the past, was responsible for this, which, how do you feel about that? Are you okay with that? Like, again, it's not said explicitly, but it definitely seems to be very heavily implied.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the whole point, is this character destroyed like the natural order of things. He stepped in to kind of, he's even the bartender in the first 8 issues, and when Glenn Morgan's having his like full meltdown, like he's like, I feel like we're in the Twilight Zone in The Bartender with the Devil. He explicitly says like what's happening. Like,
yeah,
this character is that, what if, Twilight Zone Mr. Scratch type, that it's a really vindictive and cruel entity. And what, it's kind of hard to get into like what like the demiurge technically is. And there's this one full panel spread of like this giant spider kind of holding on to planets and like all of these webs, and it's kind of this aspect of who Vindictivix is, and that is kind of this representative of the demiurge, as the Gnostics call him. And this entity is the opposite of this like benevolent, true creator deity, which was meant to actually be Mxyzptlk. Because if you like follow that along, Mxyzptlk kind of dreamt up the DC universe, and it was his planet to caretake for. And so this guy was jealous of Mxyzptlk and how he focused on Superman, and decided to kind of take over.
Right on. Okay.
It's really bizarre stuff. I know.
It's, you were on the show not too long ago, and we talked about Final Crisis, and there was, you shed a light on a lot of aspects of it. And, I hope I didn't come across as dismissive or not caring, but I certainly appreciated your insight. But I think that, where I land on some of the things, you brought up with respect to Final Crisis, or even some of the things here, it's like, even knowing what the intent was, even seeing like, oh, okay, like I get how this ties in. It's still just this feeling of, with respect to the story, it's like, okay, it doesn't, whereas again, I know for you respond to that and you get something from that. And I know a lot of Morrison fans do, so I'm not knocking it, but for me, it just doesn't really, even with the clarity, it still doesn't really do anything for me. So
here's a weird little through line that's going to sound kind of disjointed, as a Morrison comic or discussion should be. There's a poster on the wall of the movie that Lois and her niece are going to, and it's like Puck in the City or something like that. So Mxyzptlk and these fifth dimensional beings are representative of pukas. Now, the easiest way to describe what a puka is a Harvey the Rabbit. Do you remember that movie with like the giant talking rabbit and like the guy who like, the rabbit's there and nobody else sees the rabbit? Well, a puka is also a puck. It's supposed to be, once again, fifth dimensional entity, angel, demon, alien. What a puck or a puka does, and in Irish like folklore, is if you're out drunk too late and you come across a rabbit, even Donnie Darko, that's a puka. Okay. The rabbit entity in that. It basically pulls you out of time and drops you in a different reality, is what this entity is meant to do in our like mythology. So like this is like real Irish mythology. And so right at that moment is like when I was like, oh, there's like, I finally like, Miss Nixley, but it was that stupid little poster of the movie that they're exiting that's Puck in the City that I was like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing here. So Morrison is a big fan of Robert Anton Wilson, who is this like 1960s, 1970s kind of psychonaut, and I've been turning Mike San Gregorio onto this guy recently, so we're going to become even more insufferable. And Robert Anton Wilson really likes to talk about the puka, and so that is what's kind of happening with Superman. Is he in the two-dimensional realm is being pulled out and just dropped into different spaces of time during this like fight. As he's fighting throughout this whole period of time, he's unsure of even where he is. He's so disoriented by, you know, the way that Vindictivix is kind of organizing the panels for him.
No, that's the thing is, I mean, I appreciate all of that, I guess. How do I put this? Even, and again, I think I had the broad strokes of that. I mean, you definitely, there were, you know, I didn't pick up on the poster, for example. So, that definitely is an added detail. But I guess for me, it doesn't make it any more enjoyable to read.
Yeah,
I think is what it comes down to.
It's all perspective and what your interests are. And so for me, this was a great joy because I literally just finished reading Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger 3 that basically was asking all of these interdimensional questions and all of that. So it was just like, oh, wow, I'm like going right back into the stuff that I'm like focused on now. So it was just really, it was a really enjoyable read to me the whole thing through. I think if you really want to start kind of understanding Morrison more, you got to go to their idols. And Robert Anton Wilson, you read Prometheus Rising, you read the Cosmic Trigger trilogy. They're both stories that blend what is fact and what is fiction. And I think you'll start to understand Morrison more because they're kind of building off of what Robert Anton Wilson did, which was kind of, you know, Robert Anton Wilson liked to play and create like a fake religion called Discordianism, and all of these like, you know, games within our reality is what this writer would do. And Morrison is kind of carrying on that torch.
Fair enough. I'll be honest. I don't necessarily see myself doing that. I guess I always go back to, you know, in comedy, when there's a lengthy setup to the punchline, they call it a long walk, right?
Yeah.
And the longer the walk is, the better the payoff needs to be, the better the punchline. And I feel like with Morrison, for me, a lot of times it's too long of a walk for the payoff. Now, there are other instances where, you know, I think it can be worth it. I think there are, you know, look, I think an quote unquote easy example is something like JLA, where I think that was probably their most accessible work, where there were a lot of like crazy big ideas, but really filtered through that very digestible superhero prism. And maybe even something like All-Star Superman. But, you know, some of these other things, even with multiple readings, even with your insight, all of it, it's still, like, I don't even know. Like, this isn't even a case where it's like, oh, I didn't really get what was going on. I got what was going on in broad strokes. Without sharing Morrison's interests, it didn't necessarily speak to me. But yeah, it was more just that I didn't feel myself terribly invested. But I'm glad you did, and I know others are as well. I know there are fans of this run from start to finish, and that's great. I will say again, I am really glad we read the Greg Pak stuff. Again, for allowing me to sort of articulate what I did earlier about why I like his run more than Morrison's. But I don't want to not say this. We got to give props to Pak's treatment of Lana Lang in those issues. Because I've said, you know, in other episodes, I've talked about how the Superman and Lois TV show, I think, is the best treatment Lana Lang has ever received. And I don't know. I think after this, and I'll be honest, you know, I've been watching. I started my viewing project of the 80s Superboy TV show.
Yeah.
It's slow going and it's not an easy watch, but I think that's another instance where Lana is treated well. I'm very early on in the show, but that aside, you know, reading these issues, man, is this a great take on Lana, because it still preserves that not just the romantic past, but really this genuine friendship from their time in Smallville. But it gives her something to do. It gives her some agency. She's this electrical engineer traveling the world. And again, when we get into those stories of the subterranean creatures, and then later the haunting of Smallville with these creatures from the Phantom Zone, the Ultra Humanite, as it turns out, ultimately, so much of those stories are still framed. And in the subterranean creature issues in particular, you get the dual monologues of Clark and Lana, and you see how they see each other. It was kind of reminiscent of, what Jeff Loeb used to do in the Superman Batman series, where Clark and Bruce would have their narrations about what the other person was thinking. But it was just, man,
it did have that world's finest feel. Absolutely.
Yeah. I just loved.
Yeah, it absolutely had that world's finest feeling.
Yeah. So I thought that was great. And and just one other thing I want to say real quick is especially with the death of the Kents in those Pac issues that, Clark has, as he's reminiscing about that, talks about how he was all alone when his parents died, except Lana, right? Like she was still there for him. And so I think if we're talking about other instances where, the Kents being dead offers some value, offers something to explore, it does elevate Lana. Like I've talked about in other episodes, versions of the story where Pa dies, but Ma lives. Well, that gives Ma more to do. Well, kind of similarly here, if the Kents are off the board, it's like, well, what role does Lana now serve? So I really did. I thought that aspect of it was worthwhile.
Yeah, Lana kind of has her Superman birthright in these issues. It's really great. The Hollow Earth is one of my favorite conspiracy theories too. That like inside is all these subterranean tunnels and monsters and energy sources. That it's just like a really silly conspiracy theory, and that Superman gets to play in this world and fight giant kaijus is just a fun Superman story.
Yeah, it was. No, I really dug it a lot. And look, the father in me, it broke my heart when he had to send the Baka monster back underground, and he can hear the monster crying with his super hearing. Oh, it broke my heart. I'll be honest, I didn't actually shed a tear, but I welled up a little bit. That one got me.
It was a good one. It was kind of like, that's how I felt about one of those, that Crypto backstory where Crypto follows him around the Phantom Zone. And he's always there, and even it references a panel from back earlier, in the action run. But I was like, I like went and hugged my dog after that.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, that was good stuff. What have we not talked about yet that you wanted to talk about?
With the last stuff, I basically have this one note that's just what? For the Max Landis backstory with the atomic skull. Like that one just came out of nowhere, and that was it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if they even used atomic skull subsequent to that. It seemed to be a setup for something that maybe never happened. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's my only note was just, what?
Just as a side note, in the first half of this double feature, I mentioned how it was unclear to me whether or not Superman had died at the hands of Doomsday in the New 52 continuity. Reading further, it does become clear that there was a Death of Superman event in this continuity. So I retract that earlier statement, but I still stand by the fact that with the New 52 generally, it was very nebulous as far as what was in and what was out. But I did come to that realization.
Gotcha. The Phantom Stranger being tied to the Phantom Zone was really cool to me. I think that that's something to play with, that he is much bigger than he seems. And I know that it eventually is revealed that he's Judas, right? He's meant to be like Judas Iscariot. He talks about being the guy who sold out for...
That's right. Yeah, with the silver.
Yeah. And I also mentioned that there's Terrence McKenna, another one of those psychonauts, talks about machine elves, and it ties directly into Morrison's experience that they had when they talk about their like trip to the stars that they took when they went on their whole like walkabout thing. And the machine elves, fifth dimensional beings, Puka, silver shimmers, fae, elves, Puck, it's all kind of that fifth dimensional realm. So Morrison was kind of trying to explain how these beings presented themselves to them, and they speak in images. So you could see that like how like the three-dimensional structures were popping up in like their bubbles and all of that. So that was just another cool aspect that they were bringing into the comic book was the machine elves that Terrence McKenna talks about when he sees when he takes mushrooms.
Gotcha. Okay. There's one more big picture. Yeah. There's one more big picture question I want to ask you before we wrap. But real quick, I just want to say, because I know we talked about liking that social crusader aspect of the character that you see at the beginning and then it kind of falls away. But beyond what you and I read, but I read further into that truth arc just a little bit. But in the Greg Pak issues that followed what we read, The Haunting of Smallville, this is the part in the story where, again, Superman's identity has been revealed. And he's also lost a significant portion of his powers, and he's back into a t-shirt and jeans. So it really kind of did come a little bit full circle. And there's a couple of issues where he's back in his old neighborhood in Metropolis, and basically split opinions on him across the city. But within his neighborhood here, they've put on a little festival for him, and they called it Kentville. And the police show up, and the police are not happy with Superman. For the danger he's put them in, for, being at odds with them early on, right? And they are on a warpath towards this neighborhood. Now, we ultimately find out that the commanding officer here was being controlled by shadow demons. It was a whole thing. But anyway, you don't know that at that point in the story. And, there's it's actually the cover of the issue, and it also plays out within, where Superman, is holding these huge heavy chains, and he's standing in front of everyone and really literally standing up for them against this very tangible show of authority. And again, just especially in terms of what we've seen in recent years in the real world, it really packed a punch, and it really did harken back again to that social crusader, not always in line with authority. And I think that's a valuable space for Superman to occupy. I really like seeing that in those issues.
That's where I agree with you. That's where Superman plays best. I do enjoy that in the horror of Smallville, we get even some more of these like Lovecraftian Cronenberg horror elements, that were even occurring. They're good companion pieces to what's going on in Action Comics. Like, this feels like it's part of the same run. It's really nice to see that over time, that this Superman still is like, we get the t-shirt and jeans. I love the beard too, to be honest. I do kind of like the beard. We all kind of face those voids of, death and terror, and and he says it. We all, he says, but not today, at some point, about his parents. Like, I'm not going to give up, not today. And it's in this truly terrifying creature that is using the dead as puppets, literally putting, that right into everybody's head in Smallville. We all face that void. We all face the forever dark, but not today. And just, that was such a beautiful moment from Superman.
Well said, my friend. I think that's a perfect note to go out on. Listen, thank you very much for joining me for this. I really do appreciate it. And this was a lot of fun to get your take on all these stories, especially the Morrison run.
I do have one more thing.
Yes.
And it is, I'm in complete agreement with you. After that last issue, I don't care for Bizarro. I loved Bizarro in Forever Evil. I do not love the backwards talk Bizarro. I don't know where it started. I don't know why it started. I don't know why it hasn't changed. I don't know why that gag keeps happening, but it's just not enjoyable.
I know. Listen, I stand by that. I wish we could move away from it. I still think the animated series struck a nice balance, and I would be happy to go back to that. So I'm in agreement here. Well, listen, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate it. And once again, my thanks to Ken for joining me for the first half of this double feature. Audience, thank you as always. I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next week for our next all new episode. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Playing us out this week is actually Ralph himself. Ralph is a very talented musical artist who goes by Songbird, and he has new music available beginning August 16th on Spotify, Apple, and other music platforms. As a special treat, I am very honored to debut his new song, Composure, right now. Listen to the song, enjoy it, and be sure to check out Ralph's new music in 1 week. Here you go.
I can't be me around you. I can't even breathe around you. I can't be with you anymore. I've been asleep so long, lost composure, but I made it through. For so long I was hurting, but I finally found the truth. It's no one's fault, we're all so lost. For so long I was hurting, but I'm gonna make it through. I couldn't sing around you, I couldn't dream around you, I couldn't wait to get back home. I can't be me around you, I couldn't feel around you, I can't wait to sing this at a show. My heart feels better, lost composure, but I made it through. For so long I was hurting, but I finally found the truth. It's no one's fault, we're all so lost. For so long I was hurting, but I'm gonna make it through. This lifetime can feel never ending, and my mind is so condescending towards me. Still I try my best to do what's right. It's fiction, but it's worth it if I get some sleep tonight. Lost composure, but I made it through. For so long I was hurting, but I'm better without you. Lost composure, but I made it through. For so long I was hurting, but I finally found the truth. It's no one's fault, we're all so lost. For so long I was hurting, but I'm gonna make it through. For so long we were hurting, but we're gonna make it through. For so long I was hoping that I'd lay right there with you.
The spin-off podcast Digging for Justice, a DC fan journey, is available now exclusively at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, starting at the $1 level. New episodes release monthly, and many more rewards are available too, including a robust back catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.